My brother was dying in hospice, his breaths shallow and numbered. Across the hall, a frail, 80-year-old woman with no visitors grabbed my wrist with terrifying strength. Her eyes darted toward the door as she whispered, "Drive home tonight if you can. They aren't waiting for your brother to die." My name is Douglas. I am 69 years old, and that night I discovered a severed brake line under my car that was meant to send me to the grave before my nephew even landed in Chicago. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against family who tried to destroy you. The rhythmic, sterile beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the dimly lit hospice room on the south side of Chicago. I sat beside the bed, a damp washcloth in my hand, gently wiping the cold sweat from my brother Malcolm's forehead. He was 71 years old, but the aggressive cancer had withered him down to a shadow of the giant he used to be. For 40 years, Malcolm and I had built a logistics empire from a single rusted delivery truck navigating the unforgiving winters and the even more unforgiving business world of this city as two black men determined to leave a legacy. Now that legacy was confined to a hospital bed, fading with every shallow breath he took. I adjusted his blanket, my heart heavy with a grief I had to keep buried deep in my chest. I knew the end was close. The doctors had told me it was only a matter of days, maybe just hours. Needing a moment to breathe, I stepped out of the suffocating room into the quiet hallway. Across the hall was Agnes. She was 80 years old, fragile, and entirely forgotten by the world. In the 2 weeks I had been sitting vigil for Malcolm, I had never seen a single person come to visit her. No family, no friends, just the occasional nurse adjusting her medications. I had made it a habit to bring her something sweet from the cafeteria downstairs, a small gesture to break the crushing loneliness of this place. I walked into her room holding a blueberry muffin wrapped in a napkin. She was awake, staring blankly at the ceiling. I offered a warm, tired smile, hoping to bring a little light into her evening. I told her I brought her a favorite, hoping she had an appetite. But Agnes did not smile back. She did not reach for the muffin. Instead, as I leaned in close to place the napkin on her tray, her frail, trembling hand shot out. Her bony fingers wrapped around my wrist with a sudden, desperate strength that caught me completely off guard. Her grip was like a vice, her nails digging into my skin. I tried to pull back gently, asking her what was wrong, but her eyes were wide, filled with a raw, primal terror that chilled my blood. She looked frantically toward the open doorway, checking the empty hallway to make sure no one was listening. When she looked back at me, her voice was barely a raspy whisper, but the words cut through the quiet room like a siren. "Drive home tonight." She breathed out, her chest heaving with the effort. "Drive home tonight if you can. They aren't waiting for your brother to die." I froze. The muffin slipped from my other hand, crumbling onto the linoleum floor. I asked her what she meant, who was she talking about, but she let go of my wrist and turned her head toward the wall, squeezing her eyes shut. Her breathing became rapid and panicked. She pulled her thin blanket up to her chin and refused to say another word. The silence that followed was deafening. An icy knot formed in my stomach. Agnes was old, but in the days we had spoken, she had never shown a single sign of dementia. She was sharp, observant, and she knew exactly what she was saying. My mind raced, trying to process the warning. They aren't waiting. Who was they? I left her room with my heart pounding against my ribs. I checked on Malcolm one last time, making sure the nurses were aware of his status before I grabbed my heavy winter coat and headed for the elevator. The walk to the parking garage felt like an eternity. The Chicago wind whipped through the concrete structure, biting at my face, but the cold I felt was coming from the inside. The garage was deserted at this hour, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast long, unsettling shadows across the asphalt. My footsteps echoed loudly, sounding like a countdown. I reached my car, an older but reliable sedan I kept meticulously maintained. I pulled out my keys, my thumb resting on the unlock button. But as I reached for the door handle, a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread washed over me. It was that gut instinct, the primal warning system that had kept Malcolm and me alive on the tough streets decades ago. The voice of Agnes echoed in my head, "If you can." I stopped. I looked around the empty garage, feeling exposed, feeling hunted. I slowly crouched down, ignoring the ache in my knees, and pulled out my phone. I turned on the flashlight application and swept the harsh white beam under the chassis of my car. At first I saw nothing but concrete and dirt, but then the light caught a dark, slick puddle near the front driver's side tire. I dropped to my hands and knees, shining the light directly onto the undercarriage. The black fluid was actively dripping, forming a steady pool on the ground. It was brake fluid. I moved the light up, tracing the line, and my breath caught in my throat. The rubber brake hose had not worn out. It had not ruptured from age. It had been cleanly and deliberately severed with a blade. A clean cut. Someone had crawled under my car in the dark and cut my brakes. If I had gotten in, if I had started the engine and driven down the circular ramp of this garage, or worse, merged onto the busy interstate highway heading home, I would not have been able to stop. At highway speeds, the crash would have been catastrophic. It would have been a guaranteed death sentence, easily written off as a tragic accident of an exhausted, grieving old man losing control of his vehicle. I stayed on my knees in the freezing garage, staring at the severed line while the horrifying reality settled over me. I slowly stood up, my legs trembling not from the cold, but from a cold, calculated fury. I did not scream. I did not call the police. Calling the authorities now would only tip off whoever had done this, and I needed to know exactly what I was walking into. In dead silence, I walked out of the parking garage to the main street and hailed a passing cab. I sat in the back seat watching the city lights blur past the window, piecing together the timeline of this attempted murder. My nephew Brandon, Malcolm's only son, and his white wife Megan were scheduled to fly into Chicago from out of state tomorrow morning. They were supposedly coming to say their final goodbyes to a dying father, but Brandon had always been arrogant, entitled, and reckless with money, while Megan wore a sweet smile that never quite reached her calculating eyes. They were flying in tomorrow, yet someone wanted me dead tonight. The math was simple, and it was entirely lethal. If Malcolm died of cancer and I died in a tragic car crash on the very same night, Brandon would be the sole surviving heir to our entire logistics empire before his plane even touched the tarmac. The pieces of a massive, deadly conspiracy were falling into place. They thought I was just a tired old man they could easily eliminate. They thought wrong. The harsh morning sunlight cut through the hospice blinds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sterile air. I was sitting in the same vinyl chair next to Malcolm's bed when the heavy wooden door swung open. Brandon burst into the room, followed closely by his wife Megan. They were a vision of manufactured grief. Brandon, dressed in a sharply tailored designer suit that cost more than my first delivery truck, fell to his knees beside his father's bed. He buried his face in the blankets, letting out loud, theatrical sobs that echoed down the quiet hallway. Megan stood behind him, dabbing at her perfectly dry, mascara-lined eyes with a tissue. She wore a black cashmere sweater, looking less like a grieving daughter-in-law and more like a widow ready for a highly publicized funeral. As Brandon sobbed into the sterile white sheets, I stared at the back of his expensive jacket. Less than 12 hours ago, I was kneeling on the freezing concrete of a parking garage, staring at a severed brake line. A line cut by someone who stood to gain everything. And now here was the primary beneficiary crying tears that could win an award. I stayed in my chair, slouching my shoulders and letting my hands tremble just a fraction. I had to play the part they expected. I was the tired, broken-down old uncle too consumed by sorrow to see the daggers they were holding behind their backs. Uncle Douglas, Brandon choked out, looking up at me with a face twisted in practiced agony. "We got the first flight out. Why didn't you go home to rest? You look terrible." I forced a weak, raspy cough and rubbed my eyes. I was just too exhausted to drive Brandon. I mumbled, my voice cracking perfectly. I ended up sleeping on the vinyl couch in the waiting room all night. My old bones could not handle the highway in the dark. Megan stepped forward, placing a manicured hand on my shoulder. Her touch felt like a crawling spider. "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You have to take care of yourself. We cannot lose you too." I nodded slowly, looking down at the floor to hide the cold fury burning in my eyes. I knew exactly why she wanted me to drive home last night. She was disappointed her plan had failed, but her smile never wavered. The tears dried up remarkably fast once we stepped out into the hallway to give the nurses room to work. Brandon pulled out his smartphone, scrolling through some emails with an irritated sigh. "Uncle Doug, we need to talk about these facility charges," he said, his tone shifting from grieving son to annoyed executive. $10,000 for a week of palliative care. That is outrageous. The company trust should not be bleeding cash for a room that smells like bleach and death. I leaned heavily against the wall, channeling decades of patience. Malcolm and I built Southside Freight from nothing, Brandon. 40 years ago, we had one rusted box truck and a dream to keep our family fed. We hauled steel in the freezing snow while you were still in diapers. Your father broke his back to build the empire that pays for your Italian leather shoes. He deserves to pass in comfort. Brandon scoffed, crossing his arms. I know the history, Uncle. You tell it every Thanksgiving. But we have to be realistic. The logistics market is evolving. I am stepping up to modernize the empire, and we cannot afford to hemorrhage capital on overpriced medical suites when the outcome is already written. I stared at my nephew. He had never driven a rig. He had never negotiated a union contract or stayed up for 3 days straight to ensure a shipment of medical supplies made it through a blizzard. He was born on third base and genuinely believed he had hit a triple. To him, the massive logistics company his father and I built was just a personal ATM and inheritance he was entitled to without breaking a single sweat. I nodded slowly, maintaining the frail facade. Do not worry about the bills, nephew. I will handle the accounting. Brandon walked down the hall to take a business call, leaving me alone with Megan. She immediately closed the distance between us, her floral perfume overwhelming the sterile hospital smell. It was the scent of someone trying far too hard to mask something rotten. She linked her arm through mine, guiding me toward a quiet corner near the vending machines. Douglas, you really do look utterly exhausted, she murmured, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Brandon is just stressed. You know how much he loves his father. But we are worried about you. You have been carrying this heavy burden all by yourself. I gave a slight nod, letting my head droop. It is hard, Megan. Very hard. She patted my arm affectionately. I know. That is why we are here, to take the load off your shoulders. Brandon wants to start organizing Malcolm's affairs so you do not have to stress over the paperwork. Do you happen to know the combination to the heavy iron safe in his home office? The nurses mentioned they needed his social security card and we thought it might be in there. And it was a smooth lie delivered with practiced ease. The hospice already had all of Malcolm's identification on file. She was probing for access to his private documents and valuables. I blinked, slowly, feigning deep confusion. The safe. Goodness, Malcolm changed that combination last spring. I cannot seem to recall the numbers right now. My memory is just not what it used to be. Megan smiled, though her eyes hardened for a fraction of a second. Of course, Douglas. Memory slips happen to everyone at your age. That is exactly why we need to discuss the joint will. You and Malcolm drafted it years ago, right? With your mind slipping, it might be time to let Brandon take over as the sole executor. You are just too old to run a massive company and handle a complex estate. We do not want you making any costly mistakes because of a senior moment. She was gaslighting me right to my face. She wanted me to doubt my own mind, to surrender the keys to the kingdom willingly. I looked at her, widening my eyes like a frightened, confused elder. You might be right, Megan. Everything is just so foggy lately. I will have to look for the documents when I get home. She smiled, brilliantly victorious in her own mind. Do not rush, Douglas. Take your time. We will be right here to help you pack up his house. I left the hospice later that evening, taking a rideshare back to my house. The silence of my empty living room was a stark contrast to the psychological warfare I had endured all day. I sat in my armchair, the unlit fireplace offering no warmth, my mind racing through the calculated steps I needed to take next. They thought I was a senile, defeated old man. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who had survived the ruthless, cutthroat shipping wars of Chicago. Suddenly, the shrill ring of my cell phone shattered the quiet. The caller ID showed Ryan, my son-in-law. Ryan was married to my fiercely intelligent daughter, Kendra. He was a quiet, unassuming white man who wore plain button-down shirts and rarely spoke at family barbecues. But behind his mild manners, Ryan was a brilliant forensic accountant. He saw the world in ledgers tracking hidden transactions that criminals thought were buried forever. I answered the phone, skipping the pleasantries. I asked him what he had found. His voice was hushed, tightly coiled with urgency. Dad, I was monitoring the property records like you asked. Someone just tried to push through a massive transaction. I sat up straight, gripping the phone. I asked him to explain. Ryan took a sharp breath. Dad, someone just tried to use a forged power of attorney to take out a second mortgage on Uncle Malcolm's house. I told Ryan to block the transaction immediately and to freeze every asset he could access without tipping them off. I hung up the phone, my chest tight with a terrifying absolute clarity. The severed brake line, the fake grief, the push for the safe combination, and now a forged power of attorney. They were moving at lightning speed, executing a coordinated strike on our family legacy. But the missing piece of this deadly puzzle was still back at the hospice, wrapped in a thin blanket in the room across from my dying brother. Agnes knew something. She knew exactly what Megan was capable of, and I needed to know the entire truth tonight. I did not bother changing my clothes. I went straight to my kitchen pantry and prepared a thermal flask of sweet chamomile tea, the exact kind I had noticed Agnes staring at wistfully on a nurse's cart a few days prior. I grabbed the keys to my backup vehicle, an old battered pickup truck that Malcolm and I used to use for local yard runs. I drove through the icy streets of Chicago, keeping a watchful eye on my rearview mirror the entire way. The night air was freezing, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept my mind razor sharp. I slipped through the hospice sliding doors during the midnight shift change. The night staff was completely distracted, clustered around the main station, drinking stale coffee and loudly exchanging patient charts. I walked down the dimly lit corridor, my footsteps completely silent on the linoleum floor. I bypassed Malcolm's room, though it physically pained me to do so, and stepped into the deep shadows of Agnes's room. She was wide awake. Her eyes were fixed on the doorway as if she had been waiting for my return. I approached her bed, slowly unscrewing the lid of the thermal flask. The warm, comforting scent of chamomile filled the sterile air. I poured a small cup and handed it to her. I told her I brought the tea she liked and that I needed to know what she meant earlier. I told her my life depended on her honesty. Agnes took the cup with trembling hands. The warmth seemed to thaw the ice in her frail bones. She took a slow sip, closed her eyes for a long moment, and then looked at me with a gaze so lucid and sharp it completely shattered the illusion of a senile old woman. "I do not have dementia," she said, her voice steady and bitterly cold. "I am trapped in this place because my mind is perfectly fine, and that makes me a massive liability to the woman who stole my life." I sat in the chair next to her bed, leaning in close so she would not have to raise her voice. I asked her to explain everything from the beginning. She took another sip of the tea and began a story that made the blood in my veins run cold. 3 years ago, Agnes lived in a sprawling, beautiful estate in the northern suburbs with her husband, a highly successful retired architect. When his health began to decline from age, they decided to hire a private, highly recommended registered nurse to manage his daily care and physical therapy. That nurse was Megan. Agnes described how Megan had been the absolute picture of perfection during the first few months. Sweet, attentive, and endlessly patient. She won my husband over completely. Agnes whispered, her grip tightening on the plastic cup until her knuckles turned white. She slowly isolated him from his old friends, claiming they tired him out too much. She handled all his medications. She even started handling his personal mail, intercepting letters from his attorney. Then one night, my husband died. The doctors called it a sudden heart failure, entirely natural for a man of his age and frail condition. But Agnes knew her husband had been steadily improving just days before. After the funeral, the real nightmare began for her. Agnes discovered that in the months leading up to his death, her husband had supposedly signed a completely new set of legal documents. His entire estate, their life savings, the house, the vast investment portfolios had all been legally transferred into a shadowy shell company. When Agnes tried to fight it in court, a team of aggressive, highly paid lawyers produced medical records claiming she was suffering from advanced cognitive decline. Before she could mount a proper legal defense, she was stripped of her autonomy, declared legally incompetent by a judge, and dumped in this very hospice facility to rot in silence. She was left with absolutely nothing, entirely silenced by a legal system that had been weaponized against her. I heard her voice last night, Agnes said, a single tear finally escaping her eye and rolling down her wrinkled cheek. Out in the hallway, I would know that sugary, venomous voice anywhere. "She is doing it again, Douglas. She is doing to your brother exactly what she did to my husband." I sat back in the chair, the massive gravity of her words settling over me like a suffocating blanket. The puzzle was finally complete, and the picture it formed was infinitely more horrifying than a simple, greedy relative. Megan was not just a gold digger looking for a quick payday. She was a professional, calculating apex predator who specialized in elder fraud and murder. She targeted wealthy, vulnerable older men, systematically isolated them, drained their assets through forged documents and shell companies, and then eliminated them without leaving a single trace. She weaponized the legal system and fraudulent medical diagnoses to silence anyone who stood in her way. And Brandon, my arrogant, entitled nephew, was not the mastermind of this operation. He was the inside man, the perfect gullible pawn. Megan had married him to gain direct, unquestioned access to the massive logistics fortune Malcolm and I had spent our entire lives building. Brandon was too blinded by his own greed, his massive gambling debts, and his desire to play the corporate king to realize he was being entirely orchestrated by a black widow. He thought he was taking over the empire, but Megan was going to liquidate everything, funnel the cash into her hidden offshore accounts, and likely dispose of Brandon the moment he was no longer useful to her. She had tried to have my brake lines cut tonight because I was the only competent obstacle left in her path. I was the surviving founder, the one person who could challenge her forged power of attorney, demand a forensic audit, and expose her entire operation. I thanked Agnes, holding her hand gently, and promised her that her forced silence was about to end. I told her I was going to tear Megan's world apart piece by piece. I quietly left Agnes's room, my mind operating with cold, tactical precision. I stepped across the hallway and entered Malcolm's room. He was sleeping, his chest rising and falling with an unnatural, deeply labored rhythm. I walked over to the vital signs monitor and glanced down at the medical chart hanging at the foot of his bed. The night nurse had not yet done her rounds, but someone else had been here. I scanned the medication log with hyper-focused attention. My eyes locked onto the morphine dosage. Yesterday, the attending doctor had prescribed a low, steady drip to manage his pain while keeping his respiratory system completely stable. But the physical chart had been updated just an hour ago, supposedly signed off by the physician. The dosage had been drastically increased. It was a lethal amount, one that would quietly suppress his breathing until his heart simply stopped in his sleep. Another sudden heart failure, completely natural for a man in hospice care. Megan was using her medical training. She was not waiting for the cancer to take my brother. She was actively executing him tonight. I did not hesitate. I reached up to the digital IV pump and immediately dialed the morphine drip back down to the safe prescribed level the attending doctor had initially ordered. I took a pen from my pocket and carefully scratched out the fraudulent dosage update on the physical chart, replacing it with my own messy scrawl to make it look like a clerical error. I had bought my brother time, but I knew I had to get out of that room before Megan returned to check her handiwork. I drove home in my battered pickup truck, my mind sharp and calculating. The next evening I hosted a dinner at my house, a gathering that felt more like a hostage negotiation than a family meal. The air in my dining room was suffocating, thick with unspoken hostility and the sickly sweet scent of Megan's floral perfume. She sat across from me, sipping her red wine with the relaxed elegance of a predator cornering its prey. Brandon sat beside her, wearing another absurdly expensive suit, chewing his steak as if he already owned the chair he sat in. To my right sat my daughter Kendra, her posture rigid, her dark eyes flashing with a fierce, barely contained rage. Kendra had always been a fighter, protective of me and utterly disdainful of Brandon's lazy entitlement. Next to her was Ryan, my white son-in-law. Ryan was a forensic accountant, a man who lived in the quiet world of spreadsheets, tax codes, and hidden assets. Tonight he sat in absolute silence, methodically cutting his food, completely ignored by Brandon and Megan, who saw him only as Kendra's boring husband. Megan placed her wine glass on the table and leaned forward, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Douglas," she began, looking at me with wide, concerned eyes. "We went to see Malcolm this morning. It is absolutely heartbreaking to see him lingering like this. We should all pray he finds his peace very soon." The sheer audacity of her statement made my blood boil. She had tried to execute him the night before, and now she was playing the grieving angel. But before I could respond, she seamlessly shifted her tone to aggressive business tactics. "With Malcolm in this tragic state and you looking so incredibly fatigued, we really need to finalize the transition of Southside Freight. Brandon has drafted a comprehensive modernization strategy. The company needs a vibrant, youthful CEO to guide it through this difficult chapter. You need to rest, Douglas." Kendra slammed her fork down on her plate. "My father is sitting right here, Megan." Kendra snapped, her voice sharp as glass. "And Southside Freight is not some tech startup you can just hand over because Brandon bought a new briefcase. My father built that company with his bare hands." Brandon scoffed, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. "Come on, Kendra. Let us be professional. The logistics market is moving toward automated supply chains. Uncle Doug still balances books with a pencil. I have the vision to take the enterprise public. We need leadership that understands high-level corporate finance, not just someone who knows how to change a semi-truck tire." As Brandon continued to boast, throwing around empty corporate buzzwords he had memorized from a podcast, Ryan remained perfectly still. He did not look at Brandon. He did not look at Megan. He simply reached for his water glass with his right hand. At that exact moment, out of sight beneath the heavy oak dining table, I felt Ryan's left hand press against my knee. He quietly slid a tightly folded, rigid square of paper into my palm. I did not flinch. I kept my gaze fixed on Brandon, maintaining my facade of a tired, overwhelmed old man. I slipped the paper into my cardigan pocket with practiced subtlety. Ryan took a sip of his water and went back to his meal, completely invisible to the vultures circling the table. I knew Ryan. He never spoke out of turn, and he never made a move unless he had absolute, irrefutable proof. I let Brandon ramble for another 2 minutes before I let out a deep, trembling sigh. "Excuse me for a moment," I mumbled, pushing my chair back with a deliberate, shaky clumsiness. "My medication makes me a bit nauseous." I shuffled down the hallway to the bathroom, locked the heavy wooden door behind me, and turned on the faucet to mask any noise. I pulled the rigid square of paper from my pocket and unfolded it under the bright vanity lights. It was not a napkin. It was a densely printed miniature spreadsheet Ryan had smuggled out of his office. The numbers printed in stark black ink hit me with the force of a freight train. Brandon had not just been waiting around for his inheritance. He had been actively bleeding Southside Freight dry from the inside. According to Ryan's forensic tracing, Brandon had set up 3 dummy vendor accounts billed as independent maintenance contractors. Over the last 2 years, he had systematically embezzled $400,000 directly from our operational funds. But it was the second column that revealed the true, terrifying desperation of their timeline. Brandon had not invested the stolen money. He had gambled it away on volatile cryptocurrency crashes, and worse, he had taken out massive high-interest loans from local organized crime syndicates to cover his losses. The mob was closing in on him. This was not just corporate greed. It was a matter of life and death for Brandon. If Malcolm died, Brandon believed he would instantly inherit half the company, gaining the liquidity he needed to pay off his lethal debts. But there was a fatal flaw in his plan. The quarterly corporate audit was scheduled for next week. If I was still alive and competent during that audit, the embezzlement would be instantly discovered, and Brandon would be sent to federal prison before the mob could even get to him. The severed brake line in the parking garage suddenly made perfect sense. Megan had orchestrated it, but Brandon was the desperate animal cornered in a trap. They needed Malcolm dead to trigger the inheritance, and they needed me dead to prevent the financial audit. I splashed freezing water on my face, gripping the edges of the porcelain sink. They were not just impatient heirs. They were desperate, deadly criminals who had run out of time. I dried my face with a towel, took a deep, steadying breath, and adjusted my posture to ensure the frail, broken uncle mask was firmly back in place. I unlocked the door and shuffled slowly back into the dining room. Megan was in the middle of pouring another round of wine, a victorious smile playing on her lips. She raised her glass as I approached the table. "To new beginnings," she announced smoothly, her eyes locking onto mine with a chilling confidence. "And to family taking care of family." Before anyone could raise their glass, my cell phone vibrated violently in my pocket, shattering the tension in the room. I pulled it out. The caller ID flashed brightly with the name of the Hospice Center. The entire table went dead silent. Brandon lowered his glass, his jaw tightening. Megan leaned forward, her eyes narrowing like a hawk sensing blood. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It was the head night nurse, her voice panicked and breathless. "Douglas, you need to get back here right now," she urged over the chaotic background noise of rushing footsteps and shouting medical staff. Malcolm's heart rate just plummeted. "He is crashing." The drive to the hospice was a frantic blur of neon streetlights and icy wind. I had left my half-eaten dinner on the table, ignoring Brandon and Megan as they scrambled to follow me to their own car. When I burst through the heavy double doors of the intensive care wing, the chaotic symphony of medical alarms immediately assaulted my ears. A team of nurses and a resident doctor were swarming Malcolm's bed, frantically administering chest compressions. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching the violent, desperate attempts to revive my brother. The harsh fluorescent lights washed all the color from his face. He looked so incredibly small, entirely stripped of the towering presence that had commanded loading docks and boardrooms for 40 years. Brandon and Megan shoved past me into the room, panting from their run, their eyes locked not on Malcolm's face, but on the chaotic machinery keeping him tethered to the earth. The doctor finally stepped back, his chest heaving, and shook his head. The long, continuous tone of the heart monitor pierced the room, a flat line. The sound signaled the end of an era, the death of my protector, my lifelong business partner, my only brother. A suffocating wave of grief threatened to drop me to my knees right there on the linoleum floor. I wanted to scream, to grab him by the shoulders and demand he wake up and keep fighting. But I forced the agony down into the deepest, darkest vault of my mind. I locked it away completely. I could not afford to mourn him right now. To mourn was to show vulnerability, and vulnerability would get me killed. I kept my face entirely blank, forming a mask of impenetrable stone as the doctor officially pronounced the time of death. The war had officially started. The medical staff offered their hushed condolences and quietly filed out of the room to prepare the necessary paperwork. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving the three of us alone with Malcolm's lifeless body. The silence was thick and heavy, but it did not last long. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, melting into the dark corner near the privacy curtain, completely ignored by my nephew and his wife. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, switched it to silent mode, and tapped the record button. The red light blinked steadily in the darkness. What I captured on high-definition video over the next 3 minutes was a display of depravity so raw it made my stomach churn. There was no weeping. There were no prayers whispered over a father's departing soul. Instead, Brandon immediately reached down and aggressively grabbed Malcolm's left wrist. With cold, calculated precision, he unclasped the heavy gold Rolex Daytona that Malcolm had bought to celebrate our first $1 million quarter. Brandon callously slipped the heavy watch off the cooling flesh, polished the face on his expensive suit jacket, and slid it into his own pocket without a single ounce of hesitation. Meanwhile, Megan did not even look at the bed. She made a beeline for the small closet where the nurses had hung Malcolm's personal belongings. She aggressively rummaged through his heavy wool overcoat, her manicured hands diving into the pockets with greedy desperation. I watched through my phone screen as she pulled out his heavy brass keyring. She quickly detached the 2 square keys that unlocked Malcolm's private home and his secure home office. She slipped them into her designer purse with a satisfied, predatory smirk. They were plundering a corpse before the body was even cold. They were securing their access to the estate, ensuring they could raid his home safe before anyone else even realized he had passed. The sheer disrespect, the absolute lack of humanity solidified everything Ryan's forensic audit had revealed. They were not just greedy. They were sociopaths. They were vultures tearing meat from the bones of a king. I pressed the stop button on my phone and slipped the device securely into my inner breast pocket. I took a slow, deep breath, letting an icy resolve wash over every nerve in my body. I stepped out of the shadows and into the harsh fluorescent light at the foot of the bed. Brandon jumped physically, his hand instinctively flying to the pocket where the stolen Rolex now sat. Megan whipped around her purse, snapping shut with a loud, echoing click. Both of their faces, drained of color, caught perfectly in the headlights of their own guilt. I did not yell. I did not accuse them or demand they empty their pockets. I simply looked at them with a chilling, dead calmness. I let the silence stretch, letting it wrap around their throats until the tension in the room was nearly unbearable. I watched them squirm under my unblinking stare. Then I spoke in a voice so steady and quiet it commanded the entire room. "You two look exhausted by grief. Let me handle the death certificate paperwork." Brandon swallowed hard, nodding quickly as he took a nervous step back from the bed. Megan forced a shaky, trembling smile, immediately trying to slip back into her grieving widow persona, but her eyes were wild with absolute panic. They scurried toward the door, eager to escape the room and the suffocating weight of my gaze. I followed them out into the brightly lit hallway a few moments later. The panic that had briefly seized Brandon in the hospital room had already evaporated entirely, replaced by his usual arrogant entitlement. He was adjusting his suit cuffs, leaning casually against the nurse's station counter. When he saw me approach, he stood up straight and deliberately blocked my path. His tone was sharp, entirely stripped of any familial warmth. "We need to expedite the corporate transition immediately. Uncle Doug, I want the complete company ledgers and the master operational files delivered to my house by Friday." I looked at him, my expression completely unreadable. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening pitch. "Do not make this difficult. You are grieving and clearly not thinking straight. Southside Freight cannot afford a leadership vacuum, and the company needs young blood now." I looked at Brandon, his arrogant face waiting for me to yield. I gave a slow, vacant nod, telling him we would discuss the ledgers after we laid his father to rest. He scoffed and walked away. 3 days later, the south side of Chicago turned out to honor a titan. The funeral was massive, a true homegoing service that spilled out the doors of the monumental stone church and onto the surrounding sidewalks. Hundreds of people gathered to pay their respects to Malcolm. The choir sang with a soul-shaking power, the kind of music that reaches deep into your bones and demands you feel the weight of the moment. I sat in the front pew wearing my best dark suit, my face a mask of quiet mourning. Up on the altar, standing behind the polished mahogany pulpit, Brandon was delivering the performance of a lifetime. He wiped away non-existent tears with a monogrammed handkerchief, his voice wavering with practiced emotion. He spoke about his deep, unbreakable bond with his father. He painted a picture of a devoted son who had learned the value of hard work at his father's knee, a son who was now ready to carry the heavy mantle of the family legacy. It was a flawless, tear-jerking eulogy that had half the congregation weeping into their programs. But sitting just a few feet away, I felt nothing but a cold, calculating disgust. I knew the truth. I knew the watch hidden under his tailored shirt cuff belonged to the man in the casket stolen before his body was even cold. When the service concluded, the crowd moved out to the cemetery for the burial. The bitter Chicago wind swept through the gravestones, but the turnout remained massive. It was here, away from the theatrical staging of the church altar, that the real hierarchy of Southside freight revealed itself. A long line of veteran truck drivers formed near the burial plot. These were the men and women who had been with Malcolm and me since the beginning. They wore crisp, dark suits over broad shoulders that had spent decades hauling steel timber and auto parts across frozen interstate highways. They were the backbone of the empire. They did not line up to see Brandon. In fact, they walked right past the heir apparent as if he were completely invisible. One by one, they approached me. They gripped my hand with calloused fingers, pulling me into firm, respectful embraces. They looked me dead in the eye and called me boss. They shared brief, gruff memories of the early days of me and Malcolm wrenching on blown engines in the snow, of us skipping paychecks so the drivers could feed their families. They knew who really built the company. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched Brandon seethe. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would shatter. His deep-rooted inferiority complex was entirely exposed. He had the expensive suit, the corporate vocabulary, and the loud voice, but he commanded absolutely zero respect from the people who actually mattered. He was a fraud, and the veterans knew it just as well as I did. The final prayers were said, and the dirt was tossed onto the lowered casket. As the crowd began to slowly disperse toward their cars, the immediate family lingered near the gravesite. I stood alone for a moment, staring down at the polished wood, giving my brother a silent promise that I would protect everything we built. The quiet moment was abruptly interrupted by the heavy scent of floral perfume. Megan stepped up beside me, her high heels sinking slightly into the soft cemetery grass. She was holding a sleek leather clipboard. Her face was set in a mask of gentle, overwhelming sympathy. She leaned in close, her voice a soft cooing purr meant to sound like genuine affection. "Uncle Doug," she murmured, placing a comforting hand on my upper arm. "This has been such a grueling day for you. You have been so incredibly strong, but we can all see how much this is taking out of you." I turned to look at her, making sure my eyes appeared weary and unfocused. She unclipped a thick stack of legal documents and held them out toward me. Brandon and I were talking. She continued, her tone smooth and persuasive. "We know the estate taxes and the corporate transition are going to be an absolute nightmare of red tape. We do not want you burdened with any of this stress right now. You need to rest and grieve. If you just sign this power of attorney form, Brandon can handle all the lawyers, the accountants, and the banks. You will not have to lift a single finger. You are getting too frail for this kind of stress, Uncle Doug. Let us take care of you." It was a brilliantly executed trap. A grieving, exhausted widow or sibling would have signed those papers without a second thought, trading their legal autonomy for the promise of peace. With a stroke of a pen, I would be handing Megan and Brandon the legal keys to every bank account, every property deed, and every corporate asset Malcolm and I owned. They would drain the accounts, pay off their mob debts, and leave me destitute before the week was over. I looked down at the clipboard, then back up at Megan's falsely sweet face. I reached out to take the heavy metal pen she offered. I let my fingers hover over the signature line. Then I initiated my own trap. I forced my right hand to shake violently. The tremor started in my fingers and quickly moved up my wrist, a perfect imitation of an old man losing his motor control under extreme physical and emotional duress. The pen slipped from my grip, clattering loudly against the leather clipboard before tumbling down into the cemetery grass. "Oh, I am so sorry, Megan," I whispered, my voice incredibly fragile and brittle. I clutched my right hand against my chest, breathing heavily as if a sudden wave of fatigue had completely overwhelmed me. My nerves are just completely shot today. I cannot even hold the pen steady. My vision is blurring. Megan's smile strained a flash of pure irritation breaking through her sympathetic mask. She quickly bent down to retrieve the pen, trying to force it back into my hand. "It is okay, Uncle Doug. Just a quick signature. It does not have to be neat." I took a deliberate step back, shaking my head weakly. No, I simply cannot focus right now. The formal will reading is scheduled with Jonathan Pierce on Monday morning. I will sign all the necessary paperwork in his office, where I can sit down properly. I just need to go home and sleep. I turned and walked slowly toward the waiting town cars, my posture hunched and defeated. Behind me, I could feel Megan and Brandon glaring at my back. They thought I was just a weak, broken man delaying the inevitable. They had absolutely no idea that I had just locked them into a collision course with their own destruction. The diner sat on a forgotten stretch of County Road, an hour outside the Chicago city limits. Its flickering neon sign buzzed a dull red against the sleet falling from the pitch-black sky. It was the kind of place where truck drivers stopped for bad coffee and nobody asked questions. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth in the back corner. Sitting across from me was Jonathan Pierce. Pierce was the family attorney, a man whose expensive tailored suit looked entirely out of place in this greasy spoon. He was a ruthless, no-nonsense legal shark who had kept Southside Freight out of union disputes and frivolous lawsuits for 3 decades. He did not operate on emotion. He operated on leverage. I reached into my inner pocket and tossed the blank power of attorney form Megan had tried to force on me at the cemetery. It landed on the sticky table right next to his black coffee. Pierce picked it up, adjusted his silver reading glasses, and scanned the document with a cold, predatory smirk. He tossed it back onto the table with a scoff. He noted that the phrasing was amateurish, likely downloaded from some cheap internet legal site. He told me that if I had signed it, they could have legally drained my personal checking accounts before the banks opened on Monday. I folded my hands on the table, leaning forward into the dim light. I told Pierce that they were getting desperate. I explained about the mob debt Ryan had uncovered and the severed brake line in the hospital parking garage. I watched the attorney's eyes harden. Pierce had respected Malcolm deeply, and learning that Malcolm's own son was facilitating this betrayal ignited a quiet, professional fury in him. He took a slow sip of his coffee and told me it was time to change the playing field. Pierce reached into his sleek leather briefcase on the seat beside him. He pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope adorned with the official wax stamp of his law firm. He placed it squarely in the center of the table. He leaned in, lowering his voice so the lone waitress wiping the counter across the room could not hear a single syllable. He revealed that Malcolm was not the blind, trusting fool Brandon believed him to be. 6 months ago, Malcolm had noticed severe irregularities in the quarterly maintenance logs. He had suspected Brandon was skimming off the top long before Ryan conducted his forensic audit. Malcolm had come to Pierce's office in absolute secrecy. He was heartbroken, but he was also a businessman who fiercely protected his empire. Malcolm instructed Pierce to draft a completely new ironclad will. Pierce tapped his index finger against the heavy envelope. He explained the legal mechanics of the document inside. Malcolm had invoked a sweeping right of survivorship clause regarding every single corporate asset. Because we had founded Southside Freight as equal partners, the new will dictated that 100% of the company shares the commercial real estate. The operational funds and the private family trusts reverted exclusively to me upon his death. Brandon was not just sidelined. He was explicitly entirely disinherited. The document contained specific disinheritance language to prevent Brandon from contesting it in probate court. Malcolm had left his only son absolutely zero. The sheer weight of this revelation settled over me. My brother had known. He had carried the agonizing realization that his own flesh and blood was robbing him, and he had spent his final months quietly building a legal fortress to protect me. I stared at the envelope, feeling a surge of profound gratitude mixed with a bitter, crushing sorrow. Pierce elaborated on the meticulous steps Malcolm had taken to ensure Brandon could never touch a dime. Malcolm had even filmed a video deposition with Pierce in the room, clearly stating his sound mind and his explicit intention to cut Brandon out completely. This was not a document Brandon could fight by claiming Malcolm was medicated or coerced. It was a flawless legal execution. Pierce looked at me with a satisfied gleam in his eye, ready to drop the hammer on the arrogant nephew who had dared to disrespect the legacy of the company. He asked for my verbal authorization to file the documents the moment the courthouse doors opened on Monday morning. I kept my hands folded on the table. I looked at the heavy manila envelope, then up at Pierce's expectant face. I told him no. I told him to hold the will and lock it back inside his secure vault. Pierce frowned, his professional composure cracking for a fraction of a second. He reminded me that holding the will allowed Brandon and Megan to continue operating under the assumption that the old, outdated will was still in effect. He warned me that they would try to access the funds, liquidate assets, and cause massive administrative chaos. I leaned across the table, my voice dropping to a harsh, lethal whisper. I explained that if we filed the will tomorrow, Brandon and Megan would simply lose their money. They would realize the bank accounts were locked, they would pack their expensive designer bags, and they would flee the state. Being broke was not a sufficient punishment for what they had done. I reminded Pierce of the puddle of brake fluid in the dark hospital parking garage. I reminded him of the modified morphine dosage on Malcolm's medical chart. They had actively tried to murder me, and they had accelerated the death of his oldest client. I wanted them to feel the false security of victory. I wanted to let them execute their fraudulent schemes. I wanted them to cross state lines, forge signatures on federal banking documents, and commit wire fraud. Once they crossed the threshold into major federal felonies, their eventual destruction would be absolute. I wanted them to walk into a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. Pierce stared at me, his eyes widening slightly as he absorbed the sheer ruthlessness of my strategy. A slow, dark smile spread across his face. He picked up the manila envelope, slid it back into his leather briefcase, and snapped the lock shut. He agreed to hold his fire until I gave the signal. Just as Pierce fastened his briefcase, my cell phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, shielding the screen from the diner's ambient light. It was a secure, encrypted text message from Ryan. Even in text format, I could sense the urgent, frantic energy of my son-in-law. Ryan had set up digital tripwires across all our personal and corporate financial networks. The message was a direct alert from one of those tripwires. Ryan wrote that Brandon was no longer just targeting the corporate logistics accounts or Malcolm's estate. The situation had escalated massively within the last hour. Brandon was currently using the fake power of attorney document Megan had drafted, but he was not using it on his dead father's assets. Ryan's message confirmed the unthinkable. Brandon had initiated a hard credit inquiry to take out a massive high-interest mortgage against my personal home, the house I had lived in for 30 years, the house where I had raised Kendra. The mob debt must have been suffocating him, driving him to immediate reckless extremes. He was trying to steal the roof over my head right out from under me, confident that I was too senile to notice the bank notifications. The war had just crossed my front doorstep. I stared at the encrypted message from Ryan, the harsh glow of the screen illuminating the dark diner booth. Brandon was trying to mortgage my home, the sanctuary where I had raised my daughter. The sheer audacity of his desperation cemented my resolve. I texted Ryan a simple command telling him to let the initial paperwork proceed but to flag the final approval. It was time to give my nephew and his venomous wife exactly the victim they were looking for. The very next morning, my psychological warfare began. I knew Brandon and Megan were planning to drop by my house under the guise of bringing me breakfast, a thinly veiled excuse to snoop through my belongings. When I heard Brandon's heavy knock on the front door, I deliberately slipped a brown loafer onto my left foot and a black dress shoe onto my right. I unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of my cardigan, leaving it hanging crookedly off my shoulder. I walked to the kitchen and turned the front gas burner on low, letting the faint, unmistakable smell of gas waft into the air before I slowly shuffled to the front door. I pulled the door open with a vacant, wandering stare. Brandon and Megan stood on the porch holding paper bags from a local bakery. I looked right through Brandon and focused on Megan, giving her a warm, utterly confused smile. "Good morning, Susan," I croaked, using the name of Malcolm's first wife who had passed away 2 decades ago. "It is so good of you to visit." Megan's eyes widened in feigned shock, but a predatory glint immediately sparked beneath her false concern. She exchanged a triumphant, calculating glance with Brandon. Brandon stepped inside, immediately sniffing the air. "Uncle Doug," he said loudly, dropping the bags on the console table. "Did you leave the stove on?" I blinked slowly, raising a trembling hand to my temple. "The stove. Oh, I suppose I was boiling water for tea. I simply cannot remember. I must have forgotten to strike the match." Brandon rushed to the kitchen to twist the knob off while Megan guided me to the living room sofa with exaggerated care, her eyes scanning my mismatched shoes with absolute delight. Their excitement over my fabricated decline was palpable. They did not even wait a full 48 hours before escalating their scheme. 2 days later, my doorbell rang again. This time, Brandon and Megan were not holding bakery bags. They were escorting a tall, severely dressed white man carrying a sleek leather medical bag. He introduced himself as Dr. Thorne, a supposedly renowned specialist in geriatric neurology. I knew instantly he was a hired gun, a charlatan whose medical license was up for sale to the highest bidder. Megan hovered nearby, wringing her hands in a sickening display of daughterly distress. "We are just so worried about your memory lapses, Uncle Douglas," she cooed, guiding the doctor toward my armchair. "We want to make sure you are getting the absolute best care possible." Dr. Thorne did not bother with pleasantries or basic medical protocols. He did not check my blood pressure, my heart rate, or ask about my dietary habits. Instead, he pulled a clipboard from his bag and began firing a series of rapid, disorienting questions meant to confuse rather than evaluate. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens, intentionally interrupting me every time I reached a number. He flashed cards with abstract shapes and demanded I recall them seconds later, while Brandon loudly dropped a stack of heavy books in the hallway to break my concentration. I played my part flawlessly. I stumbled over my words, stared blankly at the flashcards, and repeatedly asked Dr. Thorne if he was the plumber I had called about the leaking sink. After less than 15 minutes of this theatrical farce, Dr. Thorne clicked his pen shut and turned to my nephew with a grave, rehearsed nod. He declared that my cognitive faculties were deteriorating at an alarming rate. He threw around heavy medical jargon claiming I was exhibiting undeniable signs of advanced, rapidly progressing dementia that required immediate intervention. Brandon pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket. It was a formal medical affidavit of incompetence. Dr. Thorne leaned over the coffee table and signed his name at the bottom of the page without a single shred of hesitation. I watched closely as Brandon smoothly passed a thick, unmarked white envelope into the doctor's medical bag, a blatant payoff for destroying my legal autonomy. With that stroke of a pen, they had manufactured the exact legal ammunition they needed to force me into a locked memory care facility and seize absolute control of my estate. Megan let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief, patting Brandon on the arm, as if they had just survived a tragedy rather than orchestrated a crime. The front door had barely clicked shut behind Brandon, Megan, and their corrupt physician when Kendra stormed out of the guest bedroom. My daughter had been standing in the shadows the entire time, listening to every vile word spoken in our living room. Her fists were clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. Her dark eyes burned with a fierce, protective fury that reminded me so much of her late mother. She marched toward the front door, her boots striking the hardwood floor like hammer blows. "I am going to rip her fake hair right out of her scalp," Kendra hissed, her voice vibrating with pure rage. "I am going to drag that fraud of a doctor back in here and make him eat that clipboard." I moved faster than a supposedly senile old man ever could. I stepped into her path and grabbed her by the shoulders, pulling her forcefully into the narrow kitchen pantry away from the living room windows. I closed the pantry door behind us, plunging us into the dim light. I gripped her arms tightly, looking her dead in the eye. "Kendra, stop," I whispered fiercely, my voice dropping to a harsh, commanding tone. "Do not give them a single reason to call the police on you." Kendra breathed heavily, tears of absolute frustration welling in her eyes. "Dad, they are trying to lock you in a cage. They are trying to steal the house I grew up in." I squeezed her shoulders, my expression hardening into stone. "I know exactly what they are doing. But if you punch Megan now, you give them the narrative of a volatile, dangerous family environment. Let them feel victorious. Let them dig the grave deep enough for both of them, Kendra. We need them to commit federal fraud, and they are handing us the shovel." Kendra slowly nodded, swallowing her rage as she understood the lethal geometry of my plan. I stepped out of the pantry and walked over to the bookshelf in the living room. Hidden perfectly behind a thick encyclopedia was a high-definition motion-activated camera Ryan had installed the previous night. I pulled the tiny memory card from the device and slotted it into my secure laptop. I needed to see exactly what Megan had been doing while Brandon and the fake doctor were distracting me. I scrubbed through the footage until I found the exact moment I had shuffled into the kitchen to offer the doctor water. The camera had captured Megan standing near the hallway, completely alone. Her sweet, concerned mask had instantly vanished. She pulled a burner phone from her designer purse, dialed a number rapidly, and pressed it to her ear. The sensitive microphone picked up her venomous whisper with terrifying clarity. "Make the old man crazy fast," she hissed into the receiver, her voice dripping with malice, just like I did with Agnes's husband. "I am not waiting around for nature to take its course this time. Brandon is crumbling under the mob pressure, and I need that estate liquidated by next week." The video ended, freezing on her cold, calculating eyes. She was not just planning to lock me away with fraudulent paperwork. She was contacting an outside source to chemically destroy my mind and speed up the process. The very next morning, the heavy brass lock on my front door clicked open. They did not even bother to knock. Brandon and Megan marched into the foyer, bringing the bitter Chicago wind inside with them. Trailing closely behind was a man wearing a cheap, overly shiny suit and smelling strongly of chemical cologne. Brandon introduced him loudly as Vance, a premier real estate liquidator. They swept into my living room with the arrogant entitlement of conquering generals surveying a freshly captured territory. Brandon was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his eyes darting around the room as if mentally calculating the price tag of every object in sight. Megan immediately began pointing out the original hardwood floors and the crown molding to Vance, speaking at a volume usually reserved for addressing a deaf person. She openly discussed the timeline, stating that a bed at a secure memory care facility had just opened up for Friday. They needed the house staged, listed, and sold to a cash buyer by the end of the month. Vance pulled out a laser measuring tool and began calculating the square footage of my dining room, completely ignoring my presence. Brandon paced near the fireplace, complaining to Vance about the urgent need to liquidate the asset to cover what he called unexpected corporate liabilities. I knew he meant the mob debt that was breathing heavily down his neck. Megan trailed behind the agent, appraising my belongings with greedy, calculating eyes. She ran her manicured fingers over my antique mahogany credenza and loudly asked Vance how much the mid-century furniture would fetch at a quick estate auction. They talked about me as if I were a piece of defective furniture they were preparing to haul to the local dump. They discussed locking me away in a sterile white room, heavily medicated and forgotten, while they ripped apart the sanctuary I had built over 30 years. The sheer cruelty of their invasion was breathtaking, but it was exactly the move I needed them to make. I sat deeply sunk into my worn leather armchair, playing my part to absolute perfection. I held a delicate porcelain teacup in both hands, deliberately letting my fingers shake just enough to make the ceramic rattle against the saucer. I kept my posture slouched and my eyes wide, maintaining a blank, thoroughly confused stare. I watched the red dot of Vance's laser measure bounce across the walls, occasionally passing right over my head. I did not flinch. I did not object. When Megan walked past my chair, I looked up at her with a vacant, gentle smile and asked if Malcolm was bringing the truck around for our delivery route today. Megan rolled her eyes in profound annoyance, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She patted my shoulder with mocking sympathy, telling me Malcolm was not coming and that I just needed to drink my tea and stay out of the way. I nodded obediently, bringing the cup to my lips while my mind operated with the cold, ruthless precision of a military tactician. I memorized every word they said, every timeline they established, and every vulnerability they exposed. Brandon stood by the large bay window, biting his fingernails. His desperation was palpable. The confident corporate executive mask was slipping, revealing a terrified man drowning in a lethal ocean of debt. He urged Vance to guarantee a fast cash closing, stating that traditional financing would take too long and he needed the capital routed to an offshore holding account immediately. Vance gave a greasy, reassuring grin, promising he had a network of private investors who bought properties sight unseen. Megan chimed in, demanding the funds be wired directly to an account she specifically controlled, citing Brandon's supposed stress levels. I sipped my chamomile tea, swallowing the bitter realization that my nephew was so blinded by his own panic he could not see his wife tightening the noose around his neck. I nodded vacantly at a framed painting on the wall, presenting the perfect picture of cognitive collapse. They felt absolutely victorious, entirely convinced they had outsmarted a senile old fool. They had no idea they were simply dancing to the exact tune I had composed. After 40 agonizing minutes of evaluating my life's work, Vance finally snapped his digital clipboard shut. He shook Brandon's hand enthusiastically, guaranteeing the cash buyers would be lined up by tomorrow morning. Brandon and Megan escorted him to the front door, offering false sugary smiles before shutting it behind him. Vance walked down my driveway, pulling his car keys from his shiny suit pocket. He walked halfway down the block and slid into the driver's seat of his flashy imported sedan. He was entirely alone for precisely 2 seconds. From the passenger seat, my son-in-law Ryan sat up, having reclined the seat to remain completely invisible from the street. Ryan did not threaten the sleazy real estate agent. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his unassuming briefcase and pulled out a thick, unmarked envelope. Ryan dropped the envelope onto the center console. It contained exactly double the commission Vance would have made on the fraudulent, rushed sale of my home. Vance stared at the stacks of crisp $100 bills, his greedy eyes widening. Loyalty in his profession was easily bought, and Ryan had just bought his absolute compliance. Without saying a word, Vance reached into his suit jacket. He pulled out a tiny coin-sized audio transmitter and dropped it into Ryan's open palm. While Megan had been distracted admiring the antique grandfather clock in my hallway, Vance had casually slipped the bug directly into the open pocket of her designer tote bag. Ryan gave a curt nod, took the device and stepped out of the car, disappearing down the chilly Chicago street. Later that evening, Ryan met me at his secure, soundproofed office downtown. We plugged the digital receiver into his forensic laptop and pulled up the audio feed. The recording was crystal clear. We listened as Brandon and Megan drove away from my house, their voices echoing in the confined space of their luxury car. Brandon sounded frantic, complaining about the aggressive mob enforcers who had texted him twice during the house tour. Soon the audio shifted as Brandon stepped out of the car to grab coffee, leaving Megan completely alone. The sound of rapid dialing filled our speakers. Megan was not calling a doctor or a corporate lawyer. She called an exclusive luxury travel concierge. We listened in absolute stunned silence as she smoothly booked a one-way first-class ticket to Geneva, Switzerland using her maiden name. The departure was scheduled for this coming Saturday night. The scope of her betrayal was magnificent. She was never going to pay off the mob. She was planning to liquidate the entire estate, wire the money to her hidden European accounts, and board a plane, leaving Brandon behind to face the violent wrath of the criminal underworld and the severe federal fraud charges. The bomb was set to detonate, and Megan was ensuring she would be an ocean away when Brandon took the lethal fall. The following morning brought the precise, calculated execution of our financial guillotine. I sat beside Ryan in his downtown office, watching his fingers fly across the mechanical keyboard with blistering speed. Ryan was a man of few words, but in the digital realm he was a lethal predator. With Jonathan Pierce providing the absolute legal authority of Malcolm's true will, Ryan had the clearance he needed to act as the supreme financial gatekeeper. He accessed the master banking portal for Southside Freight. For 2 years, Brandon had used these accounts as his personal piggy bank, siphoning off hundreds of thousands of dollars through fake vendor invoices to feed his gambling addiction and mask his massive underworld debts. That unrestricted access ended today. Ryan systematically initiated a hard lockdown on every single operational account, payroll ledger, and private family trust associated with the logistics empire. He altered the master routing numbers, revoked all executive signing privileges, and invalidated every piece of plastic carrying the corporate logo. The digital freeze was absolute airtight and completely unannounced. There were no warning emails or polite notices from the bank. One moment, the company coffers were wide open to Brandon and his fraudulent schemes. The next moment, a multi-million-dollar enterprise was sealed behind a cryptographic firewall that only Ryan and I could penetrate. I watched the final confirmation prompt flash a bright green on Ryan's monitor. The trap was officially set and armed. Brandon was now walking around the city with a wallet full of useless plastic, entirely unaware that the financial safety net he intended to use to save his own life had just been vaporized into thin air. Across town, oblivious to the digital execution that had just taken place, Brandon strutted into a dimly lit, high-end steakhouse in the West Loop. He was not there for a leisurely lunch or a corporate networking event. He was meeting the men who held his life in their hands. Thanks to the GPS tracker Ryan had discreetly mirrored from the company vehicle dashboard, we knew exactly where he was. Brandon sat across from 2 heavy-set enforcers representing the local syndicate. They were not men who negotiated or accepted payment plans. They had fronted Brandon $400,000, and they were collecting their principal with a massive, punishing interest rate. Brandon, fueled by the delusion of his impending inheritance and the fake medical affidavit he believed would lock me away, acted with supreme arrogant confidence. He ordered top-shelf bourbon, smiling as he assured the men that his sudden ascension to CEO of Southside Freight was a done deal. When the lead enforcer demanded the initial payment to halt the escalating death threats, Brandon smoothly reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out the heavy metal corporate black card. He tossed it onto the mahogany table with a loud clatter, arrogantly telling them to run it for $50,000 as a show of good faith. The enforcer signaled a waiter he had on the payroll to bring a mobile point-of-sale terminal to the booth. Brandon leaned back, crossing his legs, waiting for the approving beep of the machine. The waiter slid the heavy metal card through the reader. The machine spun for a few seconds, attempting to ping a bank account that Ryan had just completely severed from the network. A harsh, rejecting tone buzzed from the terminal. The screen flashed red with a code indicating a hard decline and a mandate to confiscate the card. The enforcer's expression darkened instantly, his eyes locking onto Brandon with deadly intent. Brandon frowned. his confident facade cracking slightly as he snatched the card back, claiming it was just a daily limit security measure. He demanded they run it again. The waiter complied, manually punching in the numbers. The machine buzzed its harsh rejection a second time. Brandon pulled out a secondary corporate credit card, his hands suddenly trembling, sweat beading on his forehead. Declined. He tried a third piece of plastic, this one linked to the family trust. Declined. The horrifying reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a falling anvil. He was sitting across from ruthless killers with a wallet full of dead plastic. The enforcers stood up, blocking him in the booth, their patience completely exhausted. My burner phone vibrated on Ryan's desk just minutes later. It was Brandon. I answered the call, instantly dropping my voice into the frail, breathy register of a deeply confused old man. Brandon did not bother with pleasantries or fake familial concern. His voice was shrill, completely stripped of its usual corporate bravado. I could hear the roar of city traffic and the screech of sirens in the background. He was panting heavily, likely pacing back and forth in the dirty alley behind the steakhouse, desperately trying to keep his voice down while checking over his shoulder. Uncle Doug, he gasped out the panic, practically choking him. What is wrong with the bank accounts? Every single company card is getting rejected. Did you mess with the security settings at the bank? I let out a slow, confused hum, staring directly at the frozen banking ledgers on Ryan's monitors. Cards, I mumbled, dragging the syllables out to infuriate him further. I do not know about any cards, nephew. Malcolm always handled the plastic things. Did you check the mail? Sometimes they send new ones in the mail if the old ones get tired. Brandon let out a sound that was half scream, half sob. Uncle Doug, focus. This is an absolute emergency. The accounts are frozen solid. The bank says all executive access has been completely revoked. I need you to call the branch manager right now and authorize a wire transfer. I let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, making my voice sound incredibly tired and vacant. I cannot do that right now, Brandon. The nice man with the shiny suit from yesterday said I have to go to a special home very soon. I should go lie down. My head feels very cloudy today. I pressed the end call button, cutting him off mid-sentence and leaving him to drown in his own terror. Back in the cold alley behind the steakhouse, Brandon was completely out of options. The enforcers had cornered him against the brick wall, pressing a cold, undeniable reality upon him. They did not care about bank errors, frozen trusts, or the fact that his father had just died. They gave him a final lethal ultimatum. He had exactly 48 hours to deliver the money in full, or they would take his life without a second thought. Brandon rushed back to his luxury condo in a state of absolute, unfiltered terror. Ryan and I listened intently through the audio bug planted in Megan's purse as Brandon burst through his front door shouting frantically for his wife. He told her the company accounts were locked tight and the mob had given him 2 days to live. He paced the hardwood floor, hyperventilating as he declared they could no longer wait for the sleazy real estate agent to sell my house. He told Megan they had to trigger the nuclear option immediately. They needed to force Jonathan Pierce to conduct the formal will reading by tomorrow morning. Brandon firmly believed that presenting the fraudulent medical diagnosis of my dementia would instantly invalidate my legal authority, hand him absolute control of the estate, and unlock the massive funds he desperately needed to survive. He had no idea he was rushing headfirst into a meticulously crafted ambush. The heavy oak doors of Jonathan Pierce's downtown law office swung open the following morning, ushering in the final act of this psychological war. Pierce's office was a masterclass in intimidation, situated on the 50th floor overlooking the sprawling Chicago skyline, filled with the scent of expensive leather, old paper, and polished mahogany. I had arrived 30 minutes early to settle into my role one last time. I sat slumped in a high-backed wing chair in the corner of the room, keeping my chin tucked against my chest, my hands resting weakly on the handle of a wooden cane I did not actually need. Brandon and Megan marched into the room with the aggressive, unapologetic confidence of scavengers who firmly believed the wounded prey was finally dead and ready to be consumed. They were dressed for a high society victory lap, not a solemn mourning of a deceased father. Brandon wore a sharp charcoal gray Italian suit, adjusting his silk tie with a smug, self-assured grin that masked the lethal panic gnawing at his insides. Megan stepped in right behind him, wearing a fitted navy dress and pearls, clutching the exact same designer tote bag that still held Ryan's active audio bug. They moved with a predatory arrogance, not even bothering to offer a single word of greeting or a fake glance of sympathy in my direction. Brandon immediately took the heavy leather chair positioned directly across from Pierce's massive desk, claiming the physical space as if he were already the undisputed chairman of the board. Megan sat gracefully beside him, crossing her legs and letting out a soft, impatient sigh. She looked around the opulent office with greedy, calculating eyes, likely estimating how quickly she could liquidate the antique furniture, along with the rest of our assets, before her flight to Switzerland. I kept my head down, staring blankly at the intricate patterns of the Persian rug playing the defeated, confused elder to absolute perfection. The trap was fully constructed, the heavy steel doors were locked, and the executioner was quietly preparing his blade. Pierce sat behind his massive desk, his face an impenetrable mask of cold legal professionalism. He placed a thick, sealed manila folder dead center on the polished wood and cleared his throat to begin the formal, legally mandated proceedings. Before Pierce could even utter a single syllable of the standard legal introduction, Brandon held up his hand, snapping his fingers in a gesture of profound, breathtaking disrespect. "Listen, Jonathan," Brandon said, his voice tight with the frantic, hidden desperation of a man who knew the mob was actively counting down his final hours. "We all know exactly how this works, and we are all very busy people today. I have massive corporate investors waiting on standby and an entire executive restructuring to finalize before noon. Let us just skip all the dense legal jargon and get straight to the bottom line. I need the executor transfer papers and the master account authorization forms right now. Just show me where to sign so we can liquidate these unnecessary holding trusts and get the capital flowing." Brandon leaned forward, tapping his expensive leather shoe against the hardwood floor in a rapid, nervous rhythm. Furthermore, he continued gesturing dismissively toward me without even turning his head to look at my face. "As you can clearly see, my uncle is in no condition to handle anything more complex than a bowl of warm soup. Megan and I have already secured a premium bed for him at a highly specialized memory care facility. The medical transport vehicle is arriving at his house this afternoon. We need to finalize this asset transfer this very minute so I can legally escort him to the locked ward and take over the logistics empire before the banking market closes today." Pierce did not flinch. He did not rush, nor did he allow Brandon's frantic urgency to dictate the rhythm of his domain. He simply looked at Brandon over the rim of his silver reading glasses with a gaze so intensely cold it could freeze boiling water. He calmly picked up a heavy silver letter opener and deliberately sliced through the thick red wax seal of the manila envelope. "I work for Malcolm Brandon Pierce," said his voice, slicing through the thick arrogance in the room like a surgical scalpel. "And Malcolm's final legal wishes will be read exactly as he dictated them to me, word for word, without exception." Pierce pulled out the crisp, heavy parchment of the true will. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began to read the binding legal declarations. He detailed the founding of Southside Freight, the equal partnership Malcolm and I had shared for 4 decades, and the absolute undivided ownership of the corporate properties. Brandon tapped his fingers impatiently on the armrest, literally salivating as he waited for the massive numbers to be legally handed over to him. Then Pierce reached the specific succession clauses. "I, Malcolm, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils." Pierce read, his voice amplifying in the quiet room. "Upon my passing, I invoke the right of survivorship in its entirety. 100% of my corporate shares, liquid assets, real estate holdings, and private family trusts shall be transferred immediately and exclusively to my brother and co-founder Douglas." Pierce paused, letting the devastating words hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the final fatal blow. "Furthermore, due to severe and documented breaches of trust, I explicitly and entirely disinherit my son Brandon. He shall receive no shares, no capital, and no claim whatsoever to any portion of my estate. Brandon receives absolutely nothing." The silence that instantly followed was absolute and suffocating. The color rapidly drained from Brandon's face, replacing his smug, arrogant flush with a sickly, horrifying pale. Megan froze completely, her perfectly manicured hand stopping halfway to her face, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock. The massive financial safety net they had committed murder for the logistics empire they had plotted to steal had just been legally vaporized right in front of their eyes. The sheer magnitude of the shock held Brandon paralyzed for exactly 3 seconds before pure, unfiltered survival panic violently took over. He erupted from his leather chair like a coiled spring, slamming both of his fists down onto the polished mahogany desk with a deafening crack. "That is a lie," Brandon screamed, his voice cracking at the edges, spittle flying from his trembling lips. "That is a fraudulent document. My father would never do that to me. He was manipulated by that old fool." Brandon dug frantically into his tailored suit jacket, his chest heaving with desperate, jagged breaths. He pulled out the crumpled, fraudulently signed medical affidavit from Dr. Thorne and slammed it down right on top of Malcolm's true will. "You cannot give him the company," Brandon roared, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger directly at me. "Look at him sitting there. He is a complete vegetable. I have certified medical proof that Douglas is suffering from advanced rapid-onset dementia. He is legally incompetent, he cannot be an executor, and he cannot inherit a single dime of this estate. This entire will is completely invalid, and as the only direct blood heir, I am taking immediate receivership of Southside Freight right now." The echo of Brandon's frantic shouting bounced off the mahogany walls of the office and faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. He stood there panting, his fingers still pointing at my chest, fully expecting me to cower, to mumble something incoherent, or to look to Pierce for protection. Instead, I released my weak, trembling grip on the wooden cane. I let it fall. It hit the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crack that made both Brandon and Megan jump. I did not bend down to pick it up. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the satisfying pop of my spine aligning. The hunched, defeated posture of a senile old man evaporated instantly. I stood up perfectly straight, drawing myself up to my full height. The vacant, cloudy glaze I had carefully maintained in my eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, razor-sharp focus. I reached up with steady, confident hands and buttoned my cardigan, smoothing the fabric with meticulous precision. When I finally spoke, the frail, breathy whisper was completely gone. My voice boomed through the office, a deep, resonant baritone that had commanded loading docks, negotiated multi-million-dollar union contracts, and built an empire from the ground up. "You really thought it would be that easy, Brandon?" I said my words, striking him like physical blows. "You genuinely believed that 40 years of surviving the most cutthroat industry in Chicago would end with me drooling in an armchair while a spoiled, incompetent child stole my life away." Brandon staggered backward, his pointed finger dropping uselessly to his side. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He tried to speak, but his jaw just moved soundlessly. He looked at Pierce, then back at me, his mind desperately trying to comprehend the impossible reality standing in front of him. "The dementia was a performance," Brandon, I stated, walking slowly toward the center of the room. "A necessary psychological mirror to show you exactly what you were willing to do for money. You brought a corrupt doctor into my home. You tried to sell the roof over my head. You treated me like garbage. And in doing so, you handed me every single piece of ammunition I needed to destroy you." I reached into my inner breast pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I did not toss it carelessly. I placed it deliberately on the exact center of Pierce's desk, right next to the fraudulent medical affidavit. I tapped the screen once. The high-definition video I had recorded in the hospice room began to play. The volume was turned all the way up. The sound of the flatlining heart monitor filled the elegant law office, a haunting backdrop to the visual evidence of pure depravity. On the screen, Brandon aggressively grabbed his father's lifeless wrist. The video clearly showed him stripping the heavy gold Rolex Daytona off Malcolm's cooling flesh, polishing it on his jacket, and sliding it into his pocket with a satisfied smirk. Brandon gasped, physically recoiling from the desk as if the phone were a live explosive. He brought his hands to his head, his breathing turning into shallow, jagged panics. Before he could even attempt to formulate a lie, I pulled a thick, heavy document from my other pocket. It landed on the desk with a devastating thud. "This is a 50-page forensic audit," I announced, tapping the cover sheet. "Conducted by an independent financial investigator. It details every single fake vendor invoice, every phantom maintenance contractor, and every offshore crypto transfer you authorized over the past 2 years. $400,000, Brandon. You bled your father's company dry to cover your massive losses." Brandon began to shake violently, his knees buckling slightly. "Uncle Doug, I can explain," he stammered, his voice pathetic and small. "It was a bad investment. I was going to put it all back." I ignored his miserable pleading. "But you did not just lose the money to the market," I continued relentlessly. "You borrowed heavily from the local syndicate. You are in debt to men who do not negotiate. Yesterday you tried to pay them off with a corporate black card, only to discover that I had permanently frozen every operational and trust account associated with Southside Freight. You are entirely locked out. You have exactly 24 hours left before the mob collects their debt with your life. That is why you are here screaming for an inheritance. You do not want to run a logistics empire. You just desperately need to pay off a hitman. The absolute terror in Brandon's eyes confirmed everything. He was completely broken, drowning in a tidal wave of his own criminal incompetence. But I was not finished. The financial ruin was only the foundation of my revenge. I reached into Pierce's leather briefcase, which the attorney had left open for me, and pulled out a manila folder marked with a police evidence seal. I slid it across the mahogany table until it touched Brandon's trembling hands. "You might have been able to negotiate a plea deal for the embezzlement," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, icy register. "But you cannot negotiate your way out of attempted murder." Brandon snapped his head up, his eyes wide with wild, unadulterated horror. "Attempted murder," he choked out. "I never tried to kill anyone." I opened the folder, revealing a certified mechanic's report alongside heavily stamped police documentation. 2 weeks ago, on the exact night you and your wife arrived in Chicago, I walked into the dark Hospice parking garage. My intuition told me to check my vehicle. This report confirms that my brake line was cleanly and deliberately severed with a blade. If I had driven onto the interstate that night, I would have died instantly in a catastrophic crash. I leaned across the desk, closing the physical distance between us, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. You needed Malcolm dead to trigger the inheritance, and you needed me dead to stop the upcoming corporate audit. You thought you could eliminate both founders in a single weekend and walk away with millions. It was a lethal, calculated conspiracy to commit murder, and you left a trail of forensic evidence a mile wide. The police have already matched the security footage from the garage to the rental car you drove from the airport. The crushing weight of a 20-year federal prison sentence physically collapsed Brandon. He fell to his knees on the Persian rug, clutching his chest, completely paralyzed by the reality of his total destruction. He was sobbing openly, begging for mercy, pleading with me to save him from the mob and the police. I did not look at him. I looked past him, locking eyes with Megan. Megan had not said a single word during my entire execution. She had stood perfectly still, her highly tuned survival instincts analyzing the shifting dynamics of the room. She realized instantly that Brandon was a dead man walking. The empire was impenetrable, the money was inaccessible, and the murder conspiracy was fully exposed. She made her calculated choice. Moving with absolute quiet precision, Megan slowly took a step backward. She gripped her designer purse tightly, the purse holding the one-way first-class ticket to Switzerland and access to her hidden offshore accounts. She intended to slip away, leave Brandon to take the fall for everything, and vanish across the ocean. She took another silent step, reaching behind her back for the heavy brass handle of the office door. She turned the knob and pulled the heavy oak door inward, ready to sprint for the elevators. But her escape route was blocked. Standing shoulder to shoulder in the hallway, blocking the exit entirely, were 2 uniformed Chicago police officers, their hands resting firmly on their utility belts, waiting patiently for her to step out. Megan froze her hand, gripping the brass doorknob so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. She stared at the 2 uniformed Chicago police officers blocking her escape route, her mind frantically trying to process the sudden collapse of her flawless escape plan. Brandon, still kneeling on the Persian rug in a state of absolute shock, turned his head toward the doorway. A brief, pathetic spark of hope flared in his eyes. He genuinely believed the police were there to arrest me for elder fraud, assuming his fraudulent medical affidavit had somehow triggered a protective intervention. He scrambled to his feet, pointing a shaking finger in my direction, ready to demand my immediate arrest. But the lead officer did not even look at me. He walked right past my nephew, his heavy boots thudding against the polished hardwood floor, and marched directly toward Megan. Before she could take a single step backward, the officer grabbed her wrists, spun her around with practiced efficiency, and slapped a pair of cold steel handcuffs onto her wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed through the silent law office like a gunshot. Megan gasped, her perfect composure shattering as she thrashed against the officer's grip. She immediately slipped into her sweet, victimized persona, pitching her voice into a frantic, innocent whine. She demanded to know the meaning of this outrage, claiming she was nothing more than a grieving daughter-in-law trying to manage a stressful family tragedy. She looked at Jonathan Pierce, demanding he intervene and stop this unlawful harassment. I did not let her performance last another second. I reached down to the mahogany desk, picked up my smartphone, and tapped the screen to open a second audio file. This was the recording Ryan and I had extracted from the tiny transmitter planted inside her designer tote bag, combined with the hidden camera footage from my living room. I turned the volume to the maximum level and hit play. Megan's own voice, completely stripped of its sugary sweetness, filled the room with chilling clarity. The audio captured her cold, calculating tone as she complained to a shadowy associate about the delays in liquidating the estate. Then came the damning confession. She boasted about how easy it had been to drug Agnes's husband, detailing exactly how she had manipulated his medications to induce a fatal heart attack while transferring his wealth into a shell company. A moment later, the recording shifted to her vicious whisper in my own hallway, explicitly ordering an associate to chemically destroy my mind because she was done waiting for nature to take its course. The final audio clip sealed her fate completely. It was the sound of her standing in the hospice room, admitting she had personally altered the morphine drip on Malcolm's medical chart to accelerate his death and force the immediate reading of the will. The entire room listened to her sociopathic confessions in stunned silence. The police officers tightened their iron grip on her arms, their expressions hardening with profound disgust. Megan's sweet, innocent mask evaporated instantly, her face twisted into a snarl of pure venom, her eyes flashing with a wild, feral rage as she realized she had inadvertently narrated her own life sentence. Brandon stood in the center of the room, completely bewildered. He stared at his wife, his mouth hanging open as the horrifying reality of her true nature finally registered in his panicked brain. He had genuinely believed Megan was his devoted partner in crime, his loyal co-conspirator who was helping him secure the family empire to pay off his massive underworld debts. He thought they were in this together. The door to the private adjoining conference room opened quietly, and Ryan stepped into the office. My son-in-law carried a thick, glossy folder in his hands. He did not say a word to Megan or the police officers. He walked straight over to Brandon and dropped the heavy folder directly onto the mahogany desk in front of him. Ryan adjusted his glasses, his voice a flat clinical drone that carried the absolute finality of a forensic accountant presenting a lethal audit. He instructed Brandon to open the folder and turn directly to page 3. Brandon scrambled to open the document, his hands shaking so violently he nearly tore the heavy paper. His bloodshot eyes scanned the printed text, and the last remaining fragments of his sanity shattered completely. It was a confirmed, non-refundable first-class, one-way ticket to Geneva, Switzerland. The departure time was scheduled for late tomorrow night. The passenger name listed on the itinerary was Megan's maiden name. Ryan continued speaking methodically, listing the offshore bank accounts he had uncovered in the Cayman Islands and Zurich. Every single account was registered under Megan's name exclusively. Not a single cent of the embezzled corporate funds or the projected estate liquidation was tied to Brandon. The financial architecture of her betrayal was absolutely flawless. I stepped forward, making sure Brandon heard every single word I said. She was never going to help you pay off your mob debt, Brandon. She used you for your direct access to the logistics empire, and the moment the cash hit her international accounts, she was getting on a plane and never looking back. She orchestrated the severed brake line on my car and the lethal morphine dosage in your father's hospice room, purposely leaving a trail of forensic evidence that pointed directly back to you. When the mob enforcers came to collect their $400,000 tomorrow, they were going to find you completely alone, entirely broke, and legally framed for a double homicide. She engineered your death to guarantee her own early retirement. Brandon stared at this plane ticket, his mind buckling under the crushing weight of her absolute betrayal. He turned his head slowly to look at Megan. He expected to see some flicker of remorse, some desperate attempt to deny the evidence, but Megan simply glared back at him. She offered no apologies, no tears, and no excuses. She looked at him with profound, unadulterated disgust. She sneered, calling him a pathetic, weak, incompetent fool who could not even handle a simple inheritance transfer without bringing the entire criminal underworld to their front door. She told him he deserved exactly what the syndicate was going to do to him. Something deep inside Brandon finally snapped. The sheer terror of his impending reality, combined with the vicious cruelty of the woman he had loved, ignited a primal guttural roar in his chest. He lunged across the polished office floor with murderous, uncontrolled rage. His hands were outstretched, his fingers hooked into claws aiming directly for Megan's throat. He wanted to tear her apart right there in front of the police. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric of her collar, the two uniformed officers moved with lightning speed. They tackled Brandon with brutal force. The heavy thud of his body hitting the hardwood floor shook the entire room, rattling the silver letter opener on Pierce's desk. The officers drove their knees sharply into his back, pinning him down as he thrashed wildly. They wrenched his arms behind his back, snapping a heavy pair of handcuffs onto his wrists with a decisive metallic clank. Megan struggled violently against the officer, holding her screaming, vile, hateful profanities at me, at Ryan, and at her bleeding husband pinned to the floor. Her perfect designer hair was disheveled, her expensive navy dress wrinkled and torn at the seam. She fought like a trapped animal, kicking and spitting venom all the way down the long corridor. We listened in silence as she was dragged away, her shrieks echoing through the upscale law firm until the heavy steel elevator doors finally slid shut, cutting her off from the world completely. The officers hauled Brandon up from the floor by his arms. His expensive Italian suit was ruined, covered in dust and scuff marks. Blood trickled from his nose, staining his crisp white collar a dark, brilliant red. He was sobbing uncontrollably, a pathetic, broken shell of the arrogant executive who had marched into the office just 30 minutes prior. The sheer, suffocating terror of his reality had finally crushed him. He was entirely bankrupt, disinherited, facing decades in federal prison for conspiracy to commit murder, and actively hunted by a ruthless crime syndicate that would not rest until his debt was paid in blood. He looked at me, tears streaming down his bruised face, his entire body shaking with frantic desperation. He begged me to intervene. He pleaded with me, invoking the memory of his dead father, crying that I had the money to pay off the syndicate. He sobbed that I could afford the best defense lawyers in Chicago. He begged me to remember that we were blood pleading with me not to let the mob touch him or let him rot in a concrete cell for the rest of his life. I looked at the sniveling, desperate coward standing before me. I saw the man who had stolen the watch off my dying brother's wrist. I saw the man who had gleefully watched a corrupt doctor sign away my freedom. I saw the man who was fully prepared to let me die in a catastrophic car crash, just so he could cover his gambling debts. I reached up with calm, steady hands and meticulously straightened my tie. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, walking right into Brandon's personal space until there were only a few inches between us. I looked my nephew dead in his bloodshot, terrified eyes, my expression carved from solid, unforgiving ice. "Drive home safely tonight, nephew." I turned my back on him and walked over to the large bay window overlooking the city skyline. The police officers pulled Brandon toward the exit, his screams of absolute, unfiltered terror echoing down the hallway as he was dragged away to face the devastating consequences of his own greed. 1 month later, the sterile, oppressive silence of the Cook County Maximum Security Detention Center replaced the chaotic noise of the downtown law office. The smell of bleach, stale sweat, and old iron hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the luxurious colognes and fine leather Brandon was accustomed to. I sat on a bolted metal stool on the visitor side of a thick, bulletproof glass partition. The lighting was harsh and unforgiving, casting long, dreary shadows across the gray concrete walls that seemed to close in around us. The heavy steel door on the opposite side of the room buzzed with a loud mechanical clank that echoed down the desolate corridor. A heavily armed prison guard escorted Brandon into the visitation booth. The arrogant, sharply dressed executive who had once demanded the keys to a logistics empire was completely gone. In his place stood a hollow, trembling ghost of a man swallowed up by a coarse, bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely off his diminishing frame. His hair was unkempt and greasy, his face gaunt and covered in a patchy, unwashed beard. The dark circles under his eyes were deep purple, a testament to endless nights spent staring at the ceiling of an isolation cell, terrified of the shadows and the approaching footsteps of the other inmates. He sat down heavily on the stool across from me and picked up the black plastic telephone receiver with a violently shaking hand. He was currently facing multiple federal indictments for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit murder. The prosecutors were seeking a mandatory minimum of 20 years, and without a dime to his name, he was relying on an overworked public defender who had already advised him to plead guilty. The mob was still actively looking for him, meaning his only physical safety lay behind these heavily fortified walls. I picked up my end of the receiver and held it to my ear. I did not speak. I simply stared at him through the thick, smudged glass, waiting for the nephew who had tried to end my life to make his desperate case. Uncle Doug Brandon choked out his voice, a raw, pathetic rasp that barely sounded human. Tears immediately welled in his sunken eyes and spilled down his bruised cheeks. "Thank God you came. You have to help me. I am going to die in here." He pressed his free hand against the glass, his fingers trembling wildly as if he were trying to reach through the bulletproof barrier and grab my coat. He looked like a cornered animal begging for a scrap of mercy. It was Megan, Uncle Doug. You have to believe me. She manipulated everything. She was the one pulling the strings, whispering in my ear, twisting my mind until I did not know what was real anymore. She set the trap with the mob. She isolated me from the family. She orchestrated the entire thing to leave me holding the bag while she fled to Europe. I was just trying to fix the company finances. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. He sobbed openly, now wiping his nose with the rough sleeve of his orange jumpsuit, completely abandoning any shred of dignity. The public defender is useless. He wants me to sign a plea deal that will keep me locked in a cage until I am an old man. You know I cannot survive a federal penitentiary. The syndicate has people inside. They will find me. I need a real defense attorney. I need the high-end firm Jonathan Pierce uses. You have the estate money now. You control the trusts. Please, Uncle Doug, I am begging you. Pay for my legal defense. We are blood. You are my father's brother. You cannot just leave your own flesh and blood to be slaughtered in a concrete box. I am family. I listened to his desperate, pathetic rambling without a single change in my expression. My heart, which had once held a deep, protective uncle's love for this boy, was completely hollowed out, leaving nothing but cold, hardened stone. I gripped the plastic receiver tightly and leaned closer to the glass, making sure he could see the absolute finality in my eyes. "Do not you dare invoke your father's name," I said, my voice dropping into a low, lethal register that made him physically flinch. "Malcolm gave you the world on a silver platter. He worked 18-hour shifts in the freezing Chicago winters, hauling freight with worn-out tires and a bad transmission just so you could sleep in a warm bed. He poured 40 years of blood, sweat, and agony into Southside Freight so you could attend elite private schools, wear tailored Italian suits, and pretend you were a self-made king. He built an empire to ensure you would never know the grinding poverty we grew up in on the South Side. And how did you repay a lifetime of his unconditional sacrifice? You stole from him. You bled his life's work dry to fund your degenerate gambling and your ridiculous ego. And when you got caught in a trap of your own making, you did not ask for his help. You partnered with a psychopath to execute him in his hospital bed. You let her tamper with his morphine while you eagerly waited for his heart to stop beating. You stripped the watch off his cooling wrist before the medical examiner even arrived." Brandon opened his mouth to protest, a weak whining sound escaping his lips, but I cut him off with a sharp, commanding strike to the glass. "You are not a victim of Megan's manipulation, Brandon. You were a willing, eager participant in a double homicide conspiracy because you were too much of a coward to face your own failures. You tried to cut my brake line. You tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward to rot. You threw away every ounce of humanity you possessed for a payout. You plead that we are blood. Blood makes you related, Brandon. Loyalty makes you family. You chose money. Now you get to live with the exact poverty and terror you tried to inflict on me. I will not spend a single cent of your father's legacy to save his murderer." Brandon let out a gut-wrenching wail, dropping the telephone receiver so it dangled by its metal cord. He slammed both of his hands against the thick glass, sliding down to his knees, begging and screaming my name through the thick partition. I ignored his miserable, noisy display. I reached into my heavy wool coat and pulled out a heavy, familiar object. It was the solid gold Rolex Daytona. The police had recovered it from Brandon's suit pocket during his arrest at the law office, and the authorities had returned it to me as the rightful executor of the estate. I held the gleaming watch up to the glass so Brandon could see the undeniable proof of his treachery catching the harsh prison light. Then, with deliberate, calculated slowness, I placed the gold watch down on the narrow metal ledge of the visitor partition. I left it resting right in front of his face, a silent, ticking reminder of the great man he had callously murdered for nothing. I hung my telephone receiver back on the wall hook, completely severing his line to the outside world. I turned my back on the glass and walked down the long, sterile corridor of the detention center. Brandon's muffled screams faded into the background. The heavy steel doors locked behind me with a resounding, permanent clang. I walked out into the freezing Chicago air without looking back a single time. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Southside Freight Executive Boardroom, bathing the polished mahogany table in a warm golden light. It was a stark contrast to the dreary, oppressive gray of the maximum security prison visitation room I had left behind the day before. Standing at the head of the table, I placed both hands firmly on the smooth wood, feeling the deep, resonant history of the empire Malcolm and I had built from a single rusted truck. The air in the room felt entirely different today. It was crisp, clean, and utterly cleansed of the toxic, arrogant rot that Brandon had dragged into our corporate sanctuary over the last 2 years. There were no fake vendor invoices littering the desk, no stench of desperation, and no deceitful whispers echoing off the walls. Instead, there was an atmosphere of absolute sharpened professionalism. To my right stood my daughter Kendra. She was dressed in a sharp-tailored navy suit, looking out over the sprawling Chicago logistics hub below with a gaze that was both fierce and profoundly intelligent. She had my stubborn determination and her mother's brilliant analytical mind. She had never asked for a free ride, never demanded a corner office, and had spent years quietly proving her worth in the unforgiving world of corporate management. To my left sat Ryan, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, entirely absorbed in the glowing screens of his dual forensic laptops. He was a silent, mechanical sentinel securing the perimeter of our family legacy. We were the true heirs to Malcolm's sweat and blood. The three of us stood united in the high-rise suite, an unbreakable fortress built on loyalty and competence, ready to officially reclaim the future of Southside Freight. The ghosts of the past few weeks had been thoroughly exorcised, and the massive corporate engine was finally ready to run at full power again. I picked up a heavy gold-plated fountain pen from the center of the table and pulled a thick stack of legally binding transition documents toward me. This was the moment Malcolm had ultimately prepared for when he secretly changed his will 6 months ago. He had given me absolute undisputed control, but I knew exactly where the true future of this company lay. I did not want to spend my remaining years navigating board meetings and union negotiations. I looked at Kendra, offering her a genuine, deeply proud smile. I slid the master executive contract across the mahogany surface. I told her that she had earned this empire through grit, intelligence, and unyielding loyalty. I officially transferred the title of Chief Executive Officer of Southside Freight entirely into her name. Kendra took the pen, her eyes shining with unshed tears of profound respect and gratitude. She signed her name with a bold, decisive stroke, officially taking command of the multi-million-dollar enterprise. As she finalized the last document, the rapid, rhythmic clacking of Ryan's mechanical keyboard echoed through the boardroom. My son-in-law was not just monitoring the transition. He was actively fortifying the entire financial infrastructure. Ryan announced that he had successfully implemented a series of unbreakable military-grade cryptographic firewalls across every operational ledger and private family trust. He had established multi-factor authentication protocols that required dual administrative approval for any transaction exceeding $10,000. The corporate accounts were now a digital fortress. No one would ever be able to siphon a single dime draft, a fake vendor invoice, or leverage our assets for shadow loans again. The vulnerabilities Brandon had ruthlessly exploited were permanently eradicated, sealing the company's wealth behind a wall of absolute security. The empire was officially safe, under the absolute control of a woman who actually possessed the vision to lead it into the next generation. But there was still one final lingering threat to neutralize before the transition could be considered complete. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open and Jonathan Pierce marched into the room. The ruthless family attorney looked exceptionally sharp today, carrying a sleek black briefcase containing the final legal counterstrikes. Brandon's spectacular downfall had left a massive $400,000 vacuum in the local organized crime syndicate's accounting books. The mob enforcers, realizing their primary target was locked away in a federal detention center, had aggressively pivoted their collection efforts toward the company itself. They had begun filing fraudulent commercial liens and fake collateral claims against our shipping terminals, attempting to legally bleed the money directly from our corporate holding accounts. They thought they could bully a grieving family and a corporate board into a quiet, fearful settlement. They had severely underestimated Jonathan Pierce. Pierce dropped a thick, heavily documented dossier onto the table. It was the master file Ryan had compiled containing every single piece of digital evidence regarding Brandon's illicit loans. Ryan had traced the IP addresses, the shell company routing numbers, and the encrypted communication logs between Brandon and the syndicate's shadow bankers. Pierce explained his lethal legal strategy with a cold, predatory grin. He had not sent the mob a polite cease and desist letter. Instead, Pierce had personally couriered Ryan's forensic dossier directly to the legal counsel representing the syndicate's front businesses. Pierce had attached a single terrifying ultimatum. If the mob attempted to collect a single penny from Southside Freight, or if they ever filed another fraudulent lien against our properties, Pierce would instantly hand the entire unredacted forensic package over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The evidence was so meticulously detailed it provided the FBI with everything they needed to launch a massive, devastating RICO investigation that would dismantle the syndicate's entire money laundering operation across the Midwest. The threat of total federal annihilation was absolute. Pierce announced that the syndicate's lawyers had contacted him less than an hour ago. The mob had officially withdrawn every single collateral claim and formally canceled the debt entirely. The threat was permanently neutralized. The criminal underworld had officially backed down, terrified by the sheer overwhelming force of our legal and financial retaliation. A profound, absolute silence settled over the executive boardroom. The war was officially over. The company was secure, the predators were locked behind steel bars, and the syndicate had retreated into the shadows. We had successfully defended Malcolm's legacy against every conceivable threat. Just as Kendra poured us a round of sparkling water to toast our victory, the heavy doors opened one last time. My executive assistant, a highly efficient woman who had worked with us for over a decade, stepped into the room holding a silver tray stacked with the morning's sorted mail. She placed the tray gently on the corner of the table, congratulating Kendra on her new role before quietly excusing herself. I casually sifted through the stack of glossy corporate envelopes, vendor contracts, and legal notices. But near the bottom of the pile, a stark, plain white envelope caught my attention immediately. It had no corporate logo and no printed return address. It was addressed directly to me in a shaky, erratic handwritten scrawl. I pulled the envelope from the stack, my eyes locking onto the faint blue ink of the postmark. The breath caught in my throat. It was mailed directly from the Southside Hospice Center. A chilling realization washed over me. I still had one final promise to keep. I sliced the handwritten envelope open right there in the executive boardroom. The brief note inside was penned in a shaky but undeniably sharp script. It simply read, "I saw the local news broadcasts. Please come see me." It was Agnes. I immediately excused myself from the corporate suite, leaving Kendra and Ryan to manage their newly secured financial fortress. The drive back to the Southside Hospice Center felt entirely different today. Just a few short weeks ago, I had fled this very parking lot in the dead of night, crawling on my hands and knees in the freezing cold to discover a severed brake line. I had been a hunted man desperately trying to stay one step ahead of a pair of ruthless sociopaths. Today, I pulled my restored classic sedan into the visitor parking lot with the unhurried, grounded confidence of a man who had decisively won the war. I stepped through the heavy sliding glass doors of the care facility. The oppressive smell of sterile bleach and impending death still clung heavily to the air, but the atmosphere no longer suffocated me. I nodded politely to the front desk nurses, bypassing the visitor log with familiar ease. I walked down the quiet, dimly lit corridor, my footsteps steady and deliberate on the polished linoleum floor. I passed the empty room where Malcolm had taken his final breath, offering a brief, silent nod of respect to his memory. Then I turned and stepped into the room directly across the hall. Agnes was sitting up in her elevated hospital bed. The small television mounted on the wall was muted, broadcasting a continuous loop of a local news channel. When she saw me step into the doorway, her frail hands instinctively gripped the edges of her thin, faded blanket. However, she did not look terrified anymore. She looked deeply expectant, her sharp, intelligent eyes searching my face for the absolute confirmation she desperately needed. I pulled up the same uncomfortable vinyl chair I had sat in weeks ago and offered her a warm, genuine smile. "I kept my promise to you, Agnes," I said, keeping my voice low but incredibly firm. "The nightmare is permanently over." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees, and explained everything that had transpired over the past month. I told her exactly how we had trapped Megan and Brandon in a downtown law office, completely neutralizing their financial access and capturing their vile confessions on hidden microphones. But the most critical piece of information I delivered was about her late husband. I explained that I had taken the hidden audio recordings directly to the district attorney. Because Megan had openly boasted on tape about tampering with your husband's medications and artificially inducing his fatal heart attack, the authorities had the exact probable cause they needed to act. The district attorney immediately ordered a full exhumation and a highly specialized toxicology screening of your husband's remains. The forensic pathologist found the chemical evidence hidden deep in his tissue. Agnes gasped sharply, pressing a trembling hand over her mouth as tears immediately sprang to her eyes. I continued detailing the sheer magnitude of the legal hammer that had subsequently fallen on her tormentor. Megan was not just facing federal charges for elder fraud and attempted murder against me and Malcolm. The state prosecutors had officially indicted her on multiple counts of first-degree homicide. The authorities uncovered a massive, horrifying pattern of abuse spanning multiple wealthy victims across the state. "Your husband was not her first victim," I told her gently, "but thanks entirely to your warning, he will absolutely be her last." She has been denied bail completely. She is currently sitting in a maximum security isolation cell awaiting trial, and she will never see the outside of a prison wall for the rest of her natural life. Agnes closed her eyes tightly as heavy, silent tears began to carve paths down her wrinkled cheeks. The relief radiating from her fragile frame was palpable, filling the small room with a profound sense of closure. But the justice did not stop at criminal charges, I added, pulling a certified legal document from my coat pocket and placing it gently on her movable tray table. My son-in-law Ryan worked directly with the Federal Fraud Division to track the money. They successfully traced every single offshore account and shell company Megan created to hide her stolen wealth. The federal courts have officially frozen all the assets she stole from your husband's estate. The probate judge is already fast-tracking the total reversal of her fraudulent transfers. Your home, your life savings, and your rightful inheritance are being legally returned to you. The state is making you completely whole again. Agnes let out a sound that was half sob, half breathless laugh. She reached out with both hands, grasping my wrist with the exact same intense grip she had used on that terrifying night, but this time her touch was filled with profound, overwhelming gratitude. She thanked me repeatedly, her voice breaking, telling me she had fully resigned herself to dying in this bleak, forgotten room. She said she had lost all hope that anyone in the outside world would ever believe a discarded old woman. I gently placed my other hand over hers, holding her fragile fingers securely. "You saved my life, Agnes," I told her with absolute sincerity. "If you had not warned me about my car that night, I would be dead, and my family's entire legacy would have been destroyed by those parasites. It is my turn to repay that massive debt." I explained the final phase of my visit. While the legal system was slowly unwinding the complex web of Megan's financial crimes, Agnes still needed immediate high-quality care and a proper environment to recover her dignity. I told her that Southside Freight had officially established a robust private family trust dedicated specifically to elder protection and advocacy. And our very first executive action was taking full financial responsibility for her living arrangements until her estate was returned. "By tomorrow morning, a private medical transport team will arrive at this facility," I announced, watching her eyes widen in absolute shock. "You are not spending another weekend in this depressing place. Our corporate trust has fully paid for a premium private suite at the most luxurious assisted living community in downtown Chicago. You will have a private balcony overlooking the lake restaurant quality dining, access to a massive library, and a dedicated staff of private, thoroughly vetted nurses who report directly to my son-in-law. Everything is paid in full for as long as you need it." Agnes wept openly now, burying her face in her hands as the sheer weight of her newfound freedom washed over her. The suffocating terror of her captivity was finally broken. She was going to live out her remaining years wrapped in the absolute comfort, dignity, and security she so deeply deserved. I sat with her for another hour, finalizing the transport details and ensuring the hospice administrative staff had all the appropriate discharge paperwork prepared for the morning transfer. When I finally walked out of her room, I felt a massive, invisible weight lift completely off my shoulders. I exited the building and stepped out into the crisp, biting air of the Chicago afternoon. I walked back to my car, no longer needing to look over my shoulder, no longer checking the pavement for severed lines or hidden traps. I started the engine, the classic motor roaring to life with a steady, powerful hum. As I drove away from the hospice center, merging onto the busy interstate highway, a profound, quiet peace settled deep into my bones. The predators were permanently caged. The logistics empire was completely secure. The innocent victims were protected. But as the iconic city skyline stretched out before me, the setting sun casting long golden shadows across the concrete, I realized my journey was not completely finished. There was one final thread left to tie one last vital conversation I desperately needed to have before I could truly close this dark, violent chapter of my life. I adjusted my firm grip on the leather steering wheel and changed my route. I steered the car away from the bustling city center, heading instead toward the quiet, solemn grounds of the cemetery. That evening, my home was filled with a warmth I had not felt in years. The suffocating tension that had poisoned these walls over the past month was entirely gone, replaced by the rich, comforting aromas of roasted chicken, garlic, mashed potatoes, and collard greens. I had spent the late afternoon cooking, finding a deep, restorative peace in the familiar rhythm of chopping and seasoning. The dining room table, which had recently been a battleground for corporate espionage and lethal manipulation, was now the centerpiece of a vibrant, genuine celebration. Sitting to my right was my daughter Kendra, her face practically glowing with a relaxed, unburdened happiness. She was laughing loudly, her head thrown back as Jonathan Pierce recounted a wildly inappropriate story about a pompous corporate rival he had eviscerated in court earlier that week. Pierce, the ruthless legal shark who usually operated with cold mechanical precision, had completely shed his intimidating armor. He wore a simple cashmere sweater, his tie loosened, holding a glass of aged bourbon, and smiling like an old family friend. To my left sat Ryan, my brilliant son-in-law. The quiet, invisible forensic accountant was no longer hiding his intense intellect behind a veil of silence. He was actively participating in the conversation, gesturing with his hands as he explained the sheer panic he witnessed on the banking monitors when he initiated the total financial lockdown on the mob-affiliated accounts. The atmosphere was electric with genuine connection. There were no hidden agendas, no fake smiles, and no venomous whispers recorded on hidden devices. We were just people who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the trenches fighting a brutal war to protect our legacy, and we had emerged completely victorious. I sat at the head of the table cutting my food with steady hands, letting the joyful noise of my real family wash over me like a healing balm. Looking at the three of them sharing a hearty laugh, my mind inevitably drifted back to the agonizing dinner I had hosted just a few weeks prior. That night, Brandon had sat in the exact chair Pierce currently occupied, boasting about his imaginary corporate prowess while secretly bleeding my company dry. Megan had sat right where Ryan was, now swirling her wine and plotting my psychological destruction behind her sickly sweet smile. That previous dinner had been a masterclass in sociopathic deception. The air had been thick with greed, entitlement, and the unspoken threat of violence. Every bite of food had tasted like ash, and every word spoken was a calculated maneuver to strip me of my autonomy. But tonight the contrast was absolutely profound. This table was not a chessboard, and the people sitting around it were not pawns. Ryan looked at Kendra with a deep, unwavering adoration, a stark departure from the hollow, transactional alliance Brandon and Megan had shared. Pierce treated us with absolute professional and personal loyalty, entirely unlike the corrupt, paid-off medical charlatans my nephew had brought into my home. There was no desperate scrambling for power here. Kendra was already the newly appointed chief executive officer. Ryan was the undisputed guardian of our financial fortress, and Pierce was our trusted shield. They had not demanded their positions through emotional blackmail or forged documents. They had earned their seats at this table through competence, courage, and an unyielding commitment to the truth. This was what a real family looked like. It was not defined by bloodlines or mandatory obligations. It was forged in the fires of mutual respect, transparency, and a shared moral foundation. We were a unit that could never be broken by greed or external manipulation. As the dinner plates were cleared away and the evening settled into a comfortable, mellow quiet, I reached for my glass of red wine. I tapped my spoon gently against the crystal rim. The sharp, clear chime immediately drew the attention of the room. Kendra, Ryan, and Pierce turned to me, their faces softening with respectful anticipation. I stood up from my chair at the head of the table, feeling the solid, unshakable strength in my legs. I raised my glass, locking eyes with each of them in turn. I want to thank you all. I began, my voice steady and resonant in the warm dining room. We faced an enemy that lived inside our own walls, an enemy that wore the face of family. We survived because we trusted each other when the world tried to tell us we were crazy. I took a slow breath, letting the weight of my words settle over the table. People in this city have been whispering. They say that the sudden influx of corporate wealth corrupted Brandon, that the millions of dollars in the logistics trust turned a good son into a greedy monster. But we all know that is a convenient, comforting lie. Money does not change a person. Money does not magically implant cruelty, entitlement, or a willingness to commit murder into a pure heart. Money is simply a magnifying glass. It takes whatever is already rotting in the dark corners of a human soul and amplifies it for the entire world to see. Brandon and Megan were always predators. They were always hollow, selfish, and utterly devoid of empathy. The wealth simply gave them the power and the audacity to take their masks off. It gave them the resources to execute the evil they had always harbored inside. I raised my glass slightly higher, but money also magnified what was inside this room. It magnified Kendra's fierce integrity. It magnified Ryan's brilliant loyalty. It magnified Jonathan's unyielding commitment to justice. To family, I concluded, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. The family we chose and the legacy we protected. The three of them raised their glasses in unison, echoing the sentiment before taking a slow, satisfying drink. The next morning, the biting Chicago winter had finally broken, giving way to a crisp, beautifully clear sunrise. The golden light spilled across the frost-covered lawns of my neighborhood, signaling the dawn of a completely new era. I stood by the bay window in my living room, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, watching the city slowly wake up. The house was entirely silent, but it was a comfortable, secure silence. The war had been won, the assets were locked down, and the criminals were rotting in federal detention centers. I set my coffee mug down on the kitchen counter and walked into the hallway. I reached into the hall closet and pulled out my heavy, insulated winter coat. I slipped it over my shoulders, adjusting the thick collar against the morning chill. I reached into the ceramic bowl by the front door and picked up a heavy, worn set of brass keys. They did not belong to my sedan. They belonged to Malcolm's old, meticulously restored pickup truck, the very same vehicle we had used to build our empire from nothing. I stepped out onto my front porch, my boots crunching softly against the frosty pavement. I walked down the driveway toward the classic truck parked under the sprawling oak tree. I unlocked the heavy metal door and climbed into the driver's seat, the familiar smell of old leather and motor oil wrapping around me like a warm embrace. I slid the key into the ignition and turned it. The powerful V8 engine roared to life with a steady, booming rumble. I put the truck into gear and drove out of the neighborhood. I had one final destination, one last promise to fulfill to the man who had started it all. The drive through the towering wrought iron gates of the Oakwood Cemetery was a silent, solitary pilgrimage. I parked Malcolm's meticulously restored pickup truck along the winding, frost-covered gravel path, cutting the heavy diesel engine and letting the profound, absolute quiet of the sprawling memorial grounds wash over me entirely. The biting Chicago wind whipped fiercely through the towering, bare branches of the ancient oak trees, carrying a sharp, icy sting that demanded immediate respect. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching softly against the frozen, brittle grass, and walked deliberately toward the family plot, located on a gentle, dignified crest, overlooking the distant city skyline. There was no theatrical grief on display today, no desperate sobbing for an audience, and no chaotic hospital machinery dictating the rhythm of life and death. There was only the absolute, undeniable finality of polished granite. I stopped directly in front of Malcolm's pristine headstone. The deep black engraving of his name stood out sharply against the pale gray stone, anchoring his monumental legacy permanently into the earth. For 40 years, we had fought shoulder to shoulder, building an untouchable empire from blood, sweat, and frozen diesel fuel. We had navigated a world specifically designed to break us, relying entirely on a brotherhood forged in absolute, unbreakable trust. Looking at the cold monument, the reality of his absence settled deep into my bones, but it was no longer a heavy, suffocating weight dragging me down. The frantic, terrified energy that had gripped my chest since the night in the hospice parking garage was completely gone. I stood in the freezing morning air, surrounded by the silent, towering monuments of the past, feeling an overwhelming, restorative sense of duty fulfilled. I had sworn a silent, binding oath to him as he lay dying under the blinding fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit. I had promised to fiercely protect the empire we built together and to brutally sever the rot that had infected our family tree. I had come today to deliver the final official report. I reached deep into the inner pocket of my heavy winter coat and pulled out a sleek silver flask alongside two small, heavy crystal tumblers. It was the premium-aged Kentucky bourbon Malcolm and I had always reserved strictly for signing major union contracts or celebrating the aggressive acquisition of a new fleet of commercial trucks. I unscrewed the metal cap, the rich, smoky aroma cutting instantly through the sharp, sterile winter air. I knelt slowly and placed one of the crystal glasses directly onto the frost-dusted granite base of the headstone. I poured a generous measure of the amber liquid into his glass, then filled my own, standing back up to my full height with effortless grace. I raised my tumbler in a quiet, solemn toast to the empty sky. "We won, brother," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying effortlessly over the silent rows of gravestones. "The company is completely secure from top to bottom. Kendra is sitting in your old leather chair right now, commanding the executive board with a fire and a brilliance that would make you incredibly proud. She has the unyielding vision to take Southside Freight into the next century, and she has Ryan standing right beside her, guarding the financial gates like a ruthless bloodhound. The empire is incredibly safe in the hands of the daughter who actually earned it through grit and intelligence." I took a slow, burning sip of the bourbon, letting the heat radiate down my chest and warm my core. I continued my report, delivering the news of our absolute crushing victory. The organized crime syndicate that Brandon foolishly entangled with our pristine legacy has been completely permanently neutralized. Jonathan Pierce handed their shadow bankers a legal ultimatum so terrifying and forensically detailed that they officially canceled the debt and vanished into the woodwork. They will never dare to touch a single truck in our fleet. And as for the parasites who tried to dismantle your life's work from the inside, I added, my tone dropping to a cold, unforgiving register. They are exactly where they belong. Megan is locked in a maximum security isolation block facing a mountain of federal elder homicide charges that guarantee she will take her final breath behind reinforced concrete walls. Brandon is sitting in a federal detention center, stripped entirely of his name, his arrogance, and every single dime of the inheritance he murdered you for. They tried to dig a shallow grave for us, Malcolm, but I made absolutely sure they fell headfirst into it themselves. I took another sip of the bourbon, letting the absolute finality of my words settle into the frozen, unyielding earth. The bitter wind whipped mercilessly across the cemetery hill, biting fiercely at my face and hands. But I did not shiver. With deliberate, measured movements, I unbuttoned my heavy, insulated winter coat. I slipped it off my shoulders entirely, tossing it carelessly onto the frosted grass beside the headstone. I stood there in just my tailored suit, completely exposed to the freezing Chicago morning, refusing to hunch over or seek warmth. For weeks, I had weaponized my own age and vulnerability. I had forced myself to walk with a manufactured, pathetic limp, to tremble violently on command, to wear mismatched shoes, and to stare blankly into space while venomous predators circled my living room and appraised my furniture. I had worn the degrading, humiliating mask of a senile, defeated victim because it was the only tactical way to expose the pure, unfiltered evil lurking inside my own nephew. I had to let them believe I was entirely helpless, so they would confidently execute their fraudulent schemes in the broad daylight of a hidden camera lens. I looked down at the granite headstone, reflecting deeply on the dark, ruthless depths I had to reach to protect our family. You always told me that building an empire required clean hands and an honest day's work, I said quietly to the stone, the wind carrying my words away. But defending an empire against a highly functioning psychopath requires something entirely different. I had to become a terrifying monster to defeat the monsters that infiltrated our home. I had to strip away my own empathy and operate with a cold, mechanical cruelty I never knew I possessed. I had to watch my own flesh and blood beg for mercy through thick prison glass and feel absolutely nothing in return. I paused, letting the frigid, biting air fill my lungs to capacity, feeling a profound, restorative clarity wash over my mind and soul. But the war is officially over, I declared, rolling my shoulders back and standing taller than I had in a decade. The psychological mask is permanently gone. I am no longer the tired, fragile old uncle waiting to be pushed into a locked memory care ward. I am the quiet, relentless architect of their total destruction, and I do not regret a single action I took to preserve your honor. I crouched down one last time, ignoring the biting cold of the frozen ground seeping through the fabric of my trousers. I poured the remaining drops of my premium bourbon directly onto the dark earth beside his untouched crystal glass, a final offering to the man who had shaped my entire life. I reached out with a bare, incredibly steady hand and placed my palm flat against the freezing, highly polished granite of his headstone. The stone was solid, immovable, and permanent, exactly like the legacy we had forged together against all odds. A genuine, profoundly peaceful smile broke across my face, the first completely unburdened expression I had worn since the terrifying night I found the severed brake line in the hospice parking garage. The crushing weight of the last month evaporated entirely into the crisp, clear morning sky. I ran my fingers lightly over his deeply engraved name, sealing the final chapter of our shared, violent history. I will drive home safely tonight, brother. I whispered, my final words echoing clearly and triumphantly into the whistling Chicago wind. I promise. Fade to black. The final lesson I carried away from this dark ordeal is the dangerous, self-destructive illusion of entitlement. Brandon and Megan genuinely believed that bloodline and proximity alone guaranteed them a kingdom they never once bled for. They failed to understand that a true legacy is not simply inherited through bank routing numbers or forged legal documents. It is forged through unwavering integrity, lifelong sacrifice, and absolute character. When massive wealth is handed to those entirely devoid of a moral compass, it does not elevate them, it becomes the very trap that destroys them. True power lies not in what you can steal from others, but in what you have the strength to build yourself. If you found value in this story of reclaiming your power and standing up to toxic family members, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences in the comments below.